Hello, we're back at the inquiry. So, without further ado, here we go.
You'll recall.
On the second.
Take it from me, please.
Okay.
The analysis showed that there was a very significant difference between the economic impact of a 1 metre rule and that of a second metre rule. And you and the Treasury made it absolutely plain that if the 2 metre rule continued, many businesses would remain unviable. Yes or no?
Yes or no question.
So what I did was convene a group of other secretaries of state, including from departments for business, DCMS, transport and local government, together with the CDL, to take the evidence. Few major points. One is that it would make a big difference to the number of businesses that would open, or how they could profitably open. Second was the international comparisons. At that point, 24 other countries had something less than 2 meters. And then thirdly, international organizations like the World Health Organization and the European Centre for Diseases also had recommended something different. I wrote to the Prime Minister on behalf of that group on the 3rd of June. The Prime Minister then convened a review panel involving the Chief Medical Officer, the Chief Economist, I think convened by the Cabinet Secretary. I wasn't involved in that process.
Sorry, I know I've asked you to speed up inferentially. Please try not to speed up too much.
Fine.
It makes it very hard for this to
I wrote the letter on the 3rd, containing an analysis and evidence. The Prime Minister established a panel which included the Chief Medical Officer,
yes,
chaired by the Cabinet Secretary. They made a recommendation to the Prime Minister, which he accepted, to move to 1 metre plus.
At the heart of
what was called 1 metre plus.
Yes, at the heart of that debate was the recognition, of course, that the 2 metre rule, if it remained, would be economically hugely damaging, but that while SAGE, and it was made absolutely plain to you in an email from your Principal Private Secretary on the 4th of June, while SAGE adhered to the view that science clearly supported the 2 metre rule, the scientific impact was what was described by SAGE as a continuum, not an absolute rule, and that mitigants could be put into place when it's not possible to adhere to 2 metre rule at all times. So the science lent towards and in favour of the 2 metre rule, but it recognised itself that it was a movable feast, that there could be mitigants put into place, and that it was a policy choice for the government, and that was a matter for government to decide. That's a fair summary, isn't it?
Yes, and I'd just go back to, I think there are important points, the World Health Organization and the European.
I don't want to ask you about what support there was for it in policy terms. It is obvious that the government was entitled to produce that policy, but also that there was a risk with it, but that it was a risk which the government was entitled to run.
Also worth bearing in mind that the Chief Medical Officer himself sat on the review panel that published the final recommendation about moving to 1 metre plus. I think we do need to remember that the review panel included the Chief Medical Officer, and it was their recommendation to move to 1 metre plus or 1 metre with mitigations that the Prime Minister accepted.
No, the Chief Medical Officer was on the review panel, and the review panel recommended that there be that reduction. But the Chief Medical Officer's position himself was there is a risk, but that it's a matter for government, not me, to resolve the degree to which that risk is entered into by virtue of this policy decision. He never said, Mr. Sunak, in terms of the epidemiological risk, you, the government, can go ahead with the 2 metre reduction to 1 metre rule with my blessing. That's just not what occurred, is it?
Well, my recollection is different.
Oh, of course it is.
Looking at my witness statement to jog my memory, but the review panel, I think, I was not involved in the work of the review panel. It was chaired by the Permanent Secretary to Number 10, included apparently the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer alongside the Chief Economic Advisor. It says here, and again I assume I'm quoting from the report, the guidance should change to state that 2 metres or 1 metre with risk mitigation are acceptable, and that businesses should set out the mitigations that they will introduce in their risk assessment.
The review was a policy review which the government was entitled to implement. That is common ground between us, surely. It was a policy decision which the government could take and did.
Of course, it's the government's, but I think this is an important point. My recollection of it was the Prime Minister deliberately established a panel.
My recollection was different.
To bring together, as he would like to, bring together the input from the scientific advisor, the medical officer, as well as the economic analysis, consider them together to come up with a recommendation. And I said, I'm quoting from it, I think the report or the summary of its conclusions said that the guidance should change. So that is a recommendation jointly from the panel as I read it, which
you haven't
obviously
missed
is
much.
different to what you said, but I'm just quoting from the panel
Hugo
summary
did
recommendations.
ask a yes or no
In that
question.
debate,
That was quite cool.
an important part, perhaps as equal as the economic considerations, was the question of risk. And the SAGE meeting and the COVID-S meeting and particularly the COVID-S meeting, the 22nd of June, made plain that obviously in that decision was a balance between the transmission risks and the economic consequences of not doing it. And COVID-S, to which you were, of course, a party, you were present on that meeting, was made aware that the potential for higher occupancy affects risk. It's an obvious point.
Yep.
The question of transmission and risk was something that had to be debated, and it was resolved in favour of the economic opening up. Do you agree?
Maybe it would be helpful if we may. Can we just bring up paragraph 257 of my witness statement?
But by all means.
Because that contains the panel's summary of its conclusions. Again, there's a specific point in paragraph C where it says mitigations can reduce the risk at 1 metres so that it is
The evidence shows
that it is
relative
broadly
risk.
equivalent to being 2 metres apart, noting that a precise assessment is not possible. And then the paragraph D is the bit I was quoting for before, saying that the panel concludes that the guidance should change. Again, this was a panel that I was not involved in, but contained scientific and medical advice alongside economic advice, and it went to the Prime Minister, not to me, and he acted on their recommendation, and I think rightly brought together all sides of the debate.
Mr. Sunak, there is no doubt that the review panel made a policy recommendation and it was instituted. The point is a different one. In making that decision, the government was assisted by expert scientific advice on the risk. In the very nature of that decision, there was a balance between the transmission risk and the economic consequences. That's what the debate was all about. So I simply ask you to recognise that in that debate, an important consideration, but ultimately not the winning consideration, was what risks are attendant upon such a social distancing change. Do you agree that?
I wasn't privy to the deliberations on the panel,
Okay.
because I didn't sit on it. All I can point you to is a letter that I sent to the Prime Minister, which you have in evidence, which explained my admittedly specific point of view about the economics.
I understand that, but your very own witness statement at 257C makes plain that the panel considered the risk. Risk was an important consideration. That review, of course, took place, as you know. It was published on the 24th of June. On the 8th of July, you presented your plan for jobs to the Cabinet, and Mr. Hancock said in evidence, when he gave evidence on the 30th of November, that it was at that Cabinet meeting on the 8th of July that he heard about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme for the first time. The scheme was announced, you'll recall, on the same day, the 8th of July, as part of the plan for jobs. Given that the Eat Out to Help Out scheme encouraged the coming together of different households in indoor spaces, which it did, of course, in restaurants, why was that plan not put by the Treasury in front of SAGE, in front of the Secretary of State for Health, and/or the Chief Medical Officer for their consideration of the very same issue of the absolute risk of transmission?
So the first thing to say is why do Eat Out to help out at all?
No, please. There is a method to my madness. I'm asking you why, in light of the obvious issue of risk of transmission inherent in any scheme that encouraged households to come together, did the Treasury not consult with SAGE, the CMO, the Secretary of State for Health, or anybody else outside number 10?
I think they do think you're stupid.
Because Eat
mate.
Out to Help
I think
Out
we're all
had
stupid.
been designed specifically in the context of the safe lifting of MPIs that had already been signed off, as we talked about before, as part of the May plan, which had reopened hospitality.
Schoolboy trying to get out of trouble.
Indoor hospitality. That had already been part of the approved May plan. Eat Out to Help Out only operated within that context. And indeed, there were a significant range of other MPIs that were in place, including social distancing, COVID secure guidance, table service, contactless ordering, one-way systems, all of which had been put in place. But the overall reopening of indoor hospitality had already been implemented and, as we discussed before, modelled and all the rest of it, and involved scientists in that. And Eat Out to Help Out was designed to operate within that context of the safe lifting of MPIs. It didn't do anything further than that. This was a micro policy to make sure that that capacity, which the scientists had already said was part of an overall package which could be safely delivered, was actually used. And it was done very much in that context. And in the same way that other economic decisions like a VAT cut for hospitality or a stamp duty cut or indeed furlough or anything else or grants for the hospitality industry wouldn't ordinarily be cleared with medical advisors, nor was this, because we had already made the collective decision to reopen indoor hospitality, and this was a policy that sat within and beneath that.
In addition to the obvious economic policy, which was to encourage consumption in the hospitality sector, to encourage people to use restaurants and to preserve the jobs of women and the lower paid and individuals from minority ethnic backgrounds in the hospitality sector. It's obvious that the plan was designed with a meritorious consideration in mind. But it was also part of that plan, was it not, to address what you had called the fear, the fact that data showed that our country was far and away the least likely to get back to normal, and to promote what you've described in your Spectator article as an optimistic counter-narrative. You wanted to bring about a change in behaviour, to encourage people, more people than had previously gone to restaurants the previous year, to encourage people to come together. That was part of the policy objective, was it not?
I think as you're describing it, they're one and the same. My primary concern was protecting millions of jobs of particularly vulnerable people who worked in this industry. All the data, all the evidence, all the polling, all the input from those companies suggested that unless we did something, many of those jobs would have been at risk with devastating consequences for those people and their families. And that's why independent think tanks had recommended doing something like this. Indeed, other countries had done something like this because everyone was grappling with the same issue of how to ensure that those jobs are safeguarded because people return. And that was the primary driver for what we were doing.
And all that material, Mrs. Sunak, internationally, the material from industry bodies and the like, all referred to the balance inherent in any scheme to encourage households to come together in greater numbers, the issue of risk of transmission, putting aside its obvious economic advantage and putting aside the obviously good policy reasons for encouraging restaurant use in the context of restaurants which were already COVID safe. There was no getting away from the fact that an issue for you in the Treasury was will it nevertheless have an impact on transmission? It's the elephant in the room. It couldn't be avoided, could it?
Well, no, because you made the point in your remarks. It was about COVID secure openings. Indoor hospitality had been opened as part of the May roadmap, and not opened in a casual or wanton way. It had been opened with a significant set of restrictions, including social distancing, which limited and reduced significantly the typical occupancy of a restaurant, with one-way systems, with signage, with screens, with shift work, with contactless payments. Indeed, there was 55 pages of government guidance for the hospitality industry, supplemented by 100 pages of guidance from their trade association, UK Hospitality, including the need for individual risk assessments at an individual restaurant level. So there was an extraordinary amount of work that had gone into the safe reopening of hospitality in a way that it was not previously, right? And it was an entirely different set of hospitality. And within that context, this policy was designed to ensure that the capacity that was available, that had been deemed to be safe, would actually be used in order to safeguard the jobs of some vulnerable people.
The minutes of the meeting of COVID-S, which you attended on the 22nd of June, make clear that Professor Sir Chris Whitty, in the context, you'll recall, of the debate about the reduction from 2 metres to 1 metre rule, said the most risky areas of the package were indoor hospitality and the prospect of reopening schools in September. So there was a clear flag, of course there was a flag, to the issue of transmission in the context of indoor hospitality. Yep. Why did the Treasury not raise expressly the scheme for Eat Out to Help Out in the COVID-S meeting of the 16th of July, the COVID-S meeting of the 22nd of July, the COVID-S meeting of the 6th of August, all of which were concerned with transmission risk, August planning, self-isolation periods, schools, scenarios, September return dates, but nothing about Eat Out to Help Out. Why was that?
But I think that exactly illustrates my point, because I think what people have missed in this conversation is that there was almost a month between the announcement of Eat Out to Help Out and its commencement.
You're not paying attention.
A month for people to raise concerns that they may have had. And actually, it's precisely in those 3 meetings that you mentioned, COVID-S on the 16th of July, the Chief Medical Officer in the minutes talked about 2 significant risk moments, schools and winter. He did not mention Eat Out to Help Out. On the 22nd of July, if I could just finish because it's important, on the 22nd of July, the agenda item is August planning. And again, it was not raised by the Chief Scientific Advisor or Chief Medical Officer. On the 6th of August, the COVID-S meeting that you acknowledged, again, the minutes show that returning to schools was the single riskiest element of the government's plan. Those 3 meetings all happened after the announcement of Eat Out to Help Out. All of them involved the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer. They considered specifically the forthcoming risks, and in none of those meetings was it raised by them as an issue. Indeed, the PPS to the Prime Minister has also been specific in his evidence to this inquiry that he doesn't recall representations being made to them to revisit the policy. So I know there's been a lot of commentary on this point, but there was almost a month between announcement and commencement. I've outlined my reasons for why we implemented the policy and why we thought it was the right thing to do, and I believe it was the right thing to do to safeguard those jobs in the context of the safe reopening that had already been agreed. But at none of those moments, in those meetings, there was plenty of opportunity for people to have raised it either with me or with the Prime Minister. I don't recall, and the minutes do not suggest, that it was raised at all in the 3 precise meetings that you mentioned.
Those meetings, Mrs. Sunak, were raised by you in your own witness statement as examples of meetings in which no concerns were raised. But do you accept that the issue of Eat Out to Help Out was never raised by you or your department expressly at those meetings or at any other earlier meeting, and that by the date of those meetings, the scheme had already been announced following the Cabinet on the 8th of July and announced to the public the same day? It was already in place.
But why would I raise it as a risk when I didn't believe that it was, because it was designed in the context of a safe reopening. The onus is surely on the people who now believe that it was a risk to have raised it at the time when something could have been done about it if they felt strongly.
They didn't know about it.
I'm very clear that I don't believe that it was, because hospitality had been deemed to be safe to reopen with a considerable, as I said, hundreds of pages of guidance, changes in practice, and had been recommended by think tanks and had been done by countries elsewhere.
Oh, think tanks.
This was a very reasonable, sensible policy intervention to help safeguard those jobs in that safe reopening. That was my view. I didn't believe that it was a risk. I believed it was the right thing to do.
what you're told
But
by the
if
think
others
tanks.
are suggesting that they didn't,
That's
they
all that
had
matters.
ample opportunity to raise those
indeed.
concerns in forums where I was or where the Prime Minister or others were, and they didn't.
Why didn't you tell the Secretary of State for Health in a public health crisis before the 8th of July that you were planning on announcing, once it had gone through Cabinet that day, a scheme to eat out and help out? Why didn't you, bearing in mind that this was a scheme to encourage households to come together,
Terror in
and
his
you'd
eyes.
been debating at the very same time the reduction in the 2 metre to 1 metre rules, say to the CMO, we have this plan. It's to encourage the economy to open up, to help the hospitality sector. There are very strong public policy reasons in support of it, but it's obvious there are transmission risks. Of course there were, but our position is it's all right. We are just simply going to have to do this in the greater good. But you never raised it at all with anybody outside Number 10.
And now you're accusing other people
Because,
of being
as
at
would be
fault.
completely normal for all economic policy before fiscal events, that's long-standing practice. It always has been so. I wouldn't have discussed the VAT cut on the hospitality sector with the Secretary of State for Health, or the stamp duty cut, or the grants. These are all either market-sensitive or
Yeah, that
economic
wasn't
issues.
sending
Forgive me,
people out
those are
to
all
die in a
fiscal measures.
restaurant.
The Eat Out to Help Out scheme encouraged more people, additional numbers from different households to come together in restaurants to eat.
Yes.
It
Yes.
wasn't just a fiscal issue, it was a behavioural matter.
Yeah.
Was it one that was applied across the whole of the United Kingdom?
Yes, but so were many of the economic interventions. But again, the point remains,
He's not answering
indoor
this very well, is he?
hospitality, all the points you made about people coming together and eating was already part of the May plan, had already been collectively agreed and announced.
There's complete
It had been said to the
negligence.
country, restaurants were
Absolute
safe
negligence.
to visit, with all the extra COVID secure systems that had been put in place. That was the message, so much so that the Cabinet Office ran a national campaign entitled Enjoy Summer Safely, backed it with considerable funding and national advertising, partnered with brand name companies, because the overall approach was to tell the country it was now safe to return to doing these activities because we had made progress on the virus, because we had track and trace, because we had the JBC, because we had all this COVID secure guidance. That was the very clear message backed by a national advertising campaign. It just wouldn't be entirely normal to discuss individual fiscal measures with people.
You're not entirely
that sat
normal.
within that context.
Tiny weirdo.
Do you acknowledge that the evidence from Professor Chris Whitty, Professor Sir Patrick Vallance, Professor Sir
He
Jonathan
won't accept
Van
responsibility.
Tam,
Won't count down.
respectively the CMO, GCSA, Deputy CMO, is unanimous that had they been consulted, they would have advised it was highly likely to increase transmission. And whilst, of course, it's a policy matter over which they wouldn't have had the whip hand, it was an issue on which
Only
they
in
would have
Florida,
expected to be
Xavier. That's
consulted,
very interesting.
given the behavioural aspect of the scheme, the bringing together of more people from different households. Do you acknowledge that?
But they've not said that to me. I've not seen that. And as I said, they had ample opportunity to raise those concerns between the announcement of the scheme and its implementation. None of them chose to do so in any fora that they were in. And I think all of them have said on the record, as the evidence also conclusively demonstrates, that this was in way, no shape or form responsible for a second wave, which was predicted by the CMO and CSA as early as my first conversation with them in March,
we'll come to
and
that in a
happened in
moment.
every other country in Europe.
That is a different issue with respect, and we're going to address that in a moment. The scheme itself, was it brought to the attention of the devolved administrations? Did you
Like a
ask
bowel
for their
syndrome.
input or consult with them in any way before the scheme was imposed and introduced in the other three nations.
Again, that wouldn't have been ordinary policy. It wasn't on things like the furlough scheme or other support that we did. These are competencies of the UK government are competencies of the UK government, and they are announced in the normal way.
Incompetencies of
Now, on the question of impact, it is absolutely right that you make plain that whilst there is some slim evidence to suggest that there was a correlation between the take-up of the scheme and new cases of COVID, there is other evidence, primarily in fact a paper prepared by HMRC, to suggest that there was no correlation. Some local authorities with very high eat out to help out take-up had relatively low levels of new COVID cases. Some other local authorities with high take-up had higher take-up of the COVID virus. So the evidence doesn't significantly support the proposition that there was an impact on infection rates. Nevertheless, why was the scheme not extended?
Because it was always designed to be temporary.
selectively deaf.
A submission from HM Revenue and Customs titled Eat Out to Help Out Extension dated the 26th of August said, this is a submission concerning the possible extension of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. There have been some concerns that opening up the hospitality sector has contributed to the rising rate of infection that have led to local lockdowns. So was one issue, one concern at the time that debate was had around the extension, that there was in fact or might have been an impact on infection rates?
No, the primary motivation was that it was meant to be a temporary intervention, because in order to elicit, and this is standard economic policy, in order to elicit a behavioural response, by definition what you want is for something to be temporary and credibly temporary, because otherwise you don't elicit the behavioural response that you are hoping to achieve. And as a general rule, the Treasury was always wary, as it should be, of temporary things that cost money becoming permanent, because that comes with significant fiscal implications. So the idea was very clearly to have something that was temporary to elicit the behavioural response, and that was always meant to be the case.
So it was about behavioural response in part. It wasn't just about the fiscal support for the sector. You've just said.
I mean, that's exactly right, because in order to safeguard the jobs of 2 million people working in the sector, you need people to go and use those businesses. And all the evidence analysis and general view of everyone was that it was unlikely that that was to happen, because people were not likely to return to those old behaviours, and this was designed to help encourage them to do so in a safe way. I mean, that is the explicit purpose of it. You can't safeguard those jobs without people being at the businesses so that they have the money to keep those jobs and employ those people. That's the whole point.
One codicil to this, please, Mr. Sunak. Mr. Hancock told this inquiry that he'd received feedback that the scheme was, quote, causing problems in our intervention areas. And he said that he'd told HMT about those concerns. And that must have been because from the time that he said it at the end of August, in the context of the debate about whether or not there should be an extension. Are you aware that the Secretary of State for Health, who, by your own word, didn't know in advance of the Cabinet meeting the 8th of July of the promulgation of the scheme, expressed concerns latterly to your department about the risk of transmission?
No, I'm not sure I have any record of that, but I do know he has said that there has been undue focus on this one item and is evidence to the inquiry.
Excuse me? You're suggesting he said this isn't a matter of some importance?
I think he said himself that there's been undue focus on this one item, with his words to the inquiry. And he certainly, I have no recollection of him raising that, nor do I have any record of him doing so with me at the time.
Well, it's a matter for my lady, but matters as to whether or not they are of importance, this inquiry are for this inquiry. Scientific advice. It is obvious, Mr. Sunak, that throughout the pandemic, SAGE, which consisted of highly distinguished expert contributors, gave enormous time and energy over hundreds of meetings in the service of the government.
Don't think
Do
they
you
get
agree
the
there?
question in advance, but they probably
yes,
know
and
what's
very
going to
much
be asked.
I make that same point in my witness statement as well, and I'm grateful to them for everything they did.
You say
it's
in
obvious.
the article in the
He
Spectator
asked about, he's had to
that
help out. Here's
a
what to
lady
say.
was planted on Sage. You said the Sage people didn't realise for a very long time there was a Treasury person on all their calls. And in the article, you describe how this meant that you were alerted early to the fact that the all-important minutes of Sage often
Unbelievable.
edited out dissenting voices.
Unbelievable.
It's difficult to know how much of that is journalistic flourish. But would you accept that everybody who attended Sage,
We had a spy.
or the identity of everybody who attended Sage, was known to Sage and the Secretariat that ran Sage? Because, of course, they all had to give their identities and their phone numbers for the purposes of the calls that took place.
Well, as I said there, it wasn't apparent to me in some conversations with them that they did realise, but I mean, it's almost by the by. The point
I have no
was
surviving record
there
of
was someone
that.
there
Very good.
who was feeding back
Very
information, which is incredibly helpful, and you've shared some of it before, summaries of which were often given to me verbally.
Vanessa McDougall, who was a member of your department at that time, was encouraged to attend. In fact, Sir Patrick Vallance had encouraged the attendance of somebody from Treasury on Sage in correspondence with Sir Tom Scholar. Was Sir Tom Scholar the permanent secretary in your department?
Yes.
Right. In that same article, you also say, for a year, UK government policy in the fate of millions was being decided by half-explained graphs cooked up by outside academics. That wasn't a reference to Sage, was it?
Oh, my God.
Sorry, where is that?
Oh, my God.
It's page 6.
Oh,
UK government policy in the fate of
half-explained
millions was being
graphs
decided by
cooked up.
half-explained graphs cooked up by outside academics.
Those aren't my words, just so we're clear.
Why would they appear in an article with you exclusively devoted to the issue of your performance during the pandemic crisis?
That's a question for the journalist, I think, Mr. Keith.
Would you accept that whilst the science was highly complex and uncertain, and obviously not susceptible to clear outcomes, that the advice given by Sage was, over the entirety of the pandemic, given in good faith and at the upper limits of all their professional abilities?
Yes, I make that same point in my witness statement. But having considered this, and there's again
What a
some
filthy
reflections looking back at this time with regard to Sage, I think there are a few things that I've reflected on over time that I probably was less focused on at the time. I think the first one was, and this is the point that I was getting at in the article,
let's get to the point.
Sage's views were
Elusive
presented as a consensus or a single view. I think there was definitely not an accurate perception of the degree of debate and perhaps lack of consensus within Sage.
Lack of
I think
debate.
that is how it was presented. Again, not to
Oh,
take away
no,
in any
no,
way from
in
them,
Sage.
but it was presented as a more singular view when in fact there was more debate
Is that
within
why you didn't
Sage
consult
about
Sage
most
at all
things.
about Eat Out
I
to
think
Help Out?
secondly, to
Can I,
the point,
can I ask you to pause there and just ask you about your views on that first point, Mr. Sunak?
Okay.
Evidence has been given to the effect that indeed the consensus minutes were relatively short, designed to allow people to read them. Evidence has also been given as to the extent to which they were read. But it's obvious that number 10 had officials attend Sage. Mr. Warner attended, and it's obvious that HMT had an official attend as well, in order precisely that the wider range of views could be made clear to their sponsoring departments, number 10 and the HMT. Did that not suffice? You were aware of Sage.
I don't think that
what
was
she told you.
I don't think that was the explicit reason that someone was on the calls. They were just there more generally, and I'm making the point that I think just more generally in the policy debates that were being had and in the external communications, I'm not sure the country probably understood that there was less consensus within Sage than was being presented, because this was an inherently tricky subject.
And on that issue, some evidence has been given to the effect that, of course, Sage responded to commission requests from the government. The government would raise issues with it, to which it responded. And, of course, Sage advised while government decides. That's self-evident. In your reflections, do you think SAGE could ever have been put in a position of making specific recommendations, that is to say, giving specific advice on policy outcomes off its own bat?
No, I think that they're conflating two different things there. The first is, even on the advice, not the specific policy recommendations, even on the scientific advice that they were putting, I think as many of them have now said, that they themselves were deeply divided over the scientific evidence. That's from one of them that was there at the time. I think that was underappreciated. And I think in hindsight and on reflection, it probably would be good to have made sure that there was a broader awareness of that point. I think the second thing is the science itself, as you pointed out, Mr. Keith, was itself uncertain. I think people hear science, and I reflect on it, and they think science, okay, 2 + 2 = 4, that's what this is. It clearly wasn't like that. This was uncertain science, as the scientists themselves say. It would be too simplistic to say that there was one answer on these things, and itself was prone to change. So SAGE's advice on asymptomatic transmission, the benefit of face masks or scores, all of that changed over time. So science itself was not certain. It was not singular. There was more debate about it. I'm not sure that nuance was communicated perhaps as much as it should have been, so that people could understand the decisions we were making. It wasn't as simple as crystal clear science view, crystal clear some other view. The science itself had a range of views in it. And again, for simplicity, reaching a consensus is obviously helpful for policymakers, but we can't lose sight of the fact that it was more complex than that.
But you always understood that SAGE advised while government decided. There was no question of you thinking at any time, these scientists are doing any more than giving advice to the government based on their best knowledge and experience as to what the consequences are of any particular policy decision the government reaches. SAGE never said, you, the government, must, on Monday, impose a lockdown. It just didn't work like that, did it?
I'm not sure quite how the advice was phrased.
Well, you've read the consensus.
I mean, I can't remember exactly the language you're using, but in general, SAGE's job was to provide advice to the government, but in the sphere that they had competence over, which was public health. Now, there's been a lot of commentary and debate over this point about how much there was a focus more on SAGE than other aspects of it. I think everyone from SAGE has subsequently made it crystal clear that they view policymakers as having to take into account many other considerations in their deliberations. I think they would say that. Chief Scientific Advisor said that. I would agree with that. And they had one very important input into that multifaceted process.
Forgive me.
If all they were doing was providing advice, why did you say in that Spectator article, if you empower all these independent people, you're screwed? We shouldn't have empowered the scientists in the way we did.
Yeah, I think what I would refer to there is, I think a similar comment was made by the director for the Institute for Government, and he talked about the public attention and distorting consequences of extreme focus on SAGE. I think that was the point, that in the debate, there was, I'd say, kind of an elevation of SAGE in that debate. And I think, again, on reflection, that is something to consider, whether that was appropriate, because SAGE, as we've discussed, and they would themselves would be open about,
very convenient.
had a particular focus, but it was only one focus that policymakers had to take into consideration when making decisions. Yet there was no, and I'm sure we'll come on to it later, economic SAGE and the like, there wasn't an equivalent or a similar in the public's eyes, something like SAGE for other aspects of it, and whether that distorted, in the words of the IFG director, the debate is, I think, open to discussion and deliberation. And that
we will come back to economic SAGE in a moment, Sunak. Just before we leave, though, the question of SAGE as it was, did you form any view over time as to the process by which the SAGE advice was funneled through the Chief Medical Officer and the GCSA to the Prime Minister? It's plain that they gave verbal briefings to the Prime Minister, who may or may not have read the SAGE minutes, as to what the import was of the advice that was being given almost twice a week, 3 times a week during the crisis. Did you have a view as to whether that funnel system was working?
It's probably not something that I had any great understanding of, the relationship between SAGE and the Prime Minister. As I said, I had, I think, a more granular understanding of what was happening at Sage because, as you've pointed out, someone was there able to relay to me where it was relevant a slight nuance or where there were debates and disagreements. That was helpful for me when I went into meetings, knowing that there may be more debate within Sage than was necessarily being presented in the summary of their discussion.
All right. On the issue of economic Sage, you are aware that the Institute for Government report on the Treasury during COVID from 2023 posited the possibility of a parallel committee to Sage being formed to address socio-economic issues so that the epidemiological and scientific issues could be fed through the existing Sage. In parallel, analogously, there would be a socio-economic Sage which would deal with the other countervailing considerations. It could then be brought together with another body or brought together at government level. Did you or your officials ever contemplate the institution of such a committee or take part in a debate as to whether this was a good idea to pursue?
It was never something that was raised with me, and I think the evidence that you've heard from the Treasury corporate and the Chief Economic Advisor makes clear that it was never put forward as a formal proposal, nor was an official HMT view ever sought. So that's the evidence that you have from the Treasury.
Can I just pause you there? She indeed, and it's Claire Lombardelli from the HMT, she attended a meeting, I think, or a seminar on the 5th of June.
One meeting.
And a number of options were posited: an economic Sage, a single model, or something more informal. She says in an email to her colleagues in the Treasury, thank you, 235-261, that the economists obviously killed the single model. Some like the idea of an economic Sage. It was agreed that Ben Warner would follow up with me, Vallance, Stephen Aldridge and Ian Diamond. Sir Patrick Vallance is obviously the reference to Vallance. Ian Diamond is the chair of the Office for National Statistics. Stephen Aldridge, is he HMT?
I don't know. He was the person that was on top of the memo that you
was indeed.
You had before. I recollect working with him in a previous role in a different department, and I don't remember working with him at the Treasury, so I can't tell you definitively.
But in any event, none of this was raised with you, notwithstanding what must have been your extant contemporaneous concerns about Sage.
No, but this is a different point. This is about.
Did you express internally or to others your concerns about the empowerment of scientists during the crisis, Mr. Sunak? In which case, why was there not more consideration given to this alternative model by the Treasury?
So I think the question is, there are different, as I understand the debate on the economic Sage, which again, just for the record, was not something that I remember being raised with me at all, or the Prime Minister during this period. I think we should just be clear about that. I don't think he has any recollection of it being raised, nor do his office, nor do I. But I think there are different rationales to why people think an economic Sage might have been helpful. And it's important to separate them because they're two very different rationales. One is that the modelling expertise, or more generally the expertise, didn't exist inside the Treasury to do the job. But that is something that I don't think is true. I think the Treasury did have the capability to do the analysis that we needed. It improved it over time, but it also engaged extensively with external people and economists, as it should do, to build that advice, use new forms of data. And the second thing is, there exist already independent organisations, principally the OBR, but also the Bank of England and others. So HMT is not operating in a vacuum. There are many other independent bodies doing very similar job and doing it at a very high level. So I don't think that reason for an economic Sage stacks up, and I'm happy to elaborate. There's a separate rationale, which I think, Mr. Keith, is a bit more what you were alluding to, which is that it might be helpful as a counterweight in the narrative, because if you had a public health Sage, then you needed an economic Sage. Now, that's a different reason. I'm not personally particularly persuaded by that, because I think the expertise exists. It's more for government to decide how it wants to appropriately balance these things.
You are, with respect to the government now. You must have formed a view as to whether or not, in the light of this crisis, the optimum system was put into place and whether or not there is, in fact, a very good argument for having a parallel body for dealing with other non-scientific.
So I said I'm not particularly
not have a
persuaded
line
that it's
government
necessary because,
these
unlike
messages.
SAGE, that expertise exists within government departments. The Treasury has the ability to do the modelling and the analysis that's necessary on the economy, and it works with external bodies. Indeed, you mentioned Ian Diamond. He himself has said that he worked closely with the Treasury during this period. I think is indicative of their approach. There are other organisations that do the same type of thing. And ditto in other departments, that expertise will already exist. The difference with SAGE is that expertise did not exist within DH, as I understand it, which is why it was necessary. So I don't think that rationale really supports the need for an economic SAGE. There's a separate point, though, about titles, structures, not
Fishy
to
soon out.
develop extra information, but just how they are weighed in the debate and the discussion. Now, again, I've expressed some views about reflections about how SAGE was perceived, which I think I tend to agree with the Institute for Government comment that there was kind of, as I forget his exact words, but there was a slightly disproportionate focus. I think that's right. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to create countervailing structures elsewhere. You can just choose to communicate or think about SAGE differently, or the science SAGE. Again, people may have different points of view on that. I think reasonable people could disagree, but my reflections are that it wouldn't necessarily have added to anything.
It's obvious that the Treasury provided
Ask them about
detailed analysis to Number 10, relayed through you, relayed through these bilateral meetings, relayed as part of emails to Number 10 in the Cabinet Office. But that advice, of course, was not transparent in the same way that the SAGE advice was. Would you agree? These weren't reflections of an HMT committee, the minutes of which were then condensed and published and made known to the world.
Yes, I think that is. Well, actually, it's not quite right, because HMT did publish a considerable amount of information.
Of underlying data. But the data, the information, the advice and the analysis which was given directly to Downing Street by HMT was never itself published, was it?
I think that is, that's entirely normal. But yes, I think that's the same goes for every department, by the way, including Department for Health and everything else.
Yes, but of course we are examining this issue in the unique circumstances of the ultimate decision-making process that the Prime Minister was forced to engage with, which is how to balance economic, societal, and the many other considerations in a way which would command confidence and bring, of course, the government and the public with it.
But again, I think
We're gonna have a
even if the
Prime
precise
Minister
advice
since
itself
2016.
wasn't published, there was considerable information in the
Smash the
public
like
domain put there by HMT alongside all the field events that I did, of which there were many during this period, but also by the government's independent forecast. So you have to remember, for over a decade now, the government has had an independent forecaster, so it doesn't mark its own homework in the OBR. They published extensively on the impacts of all these things, as did the Bank of England, who contain probably more people engaged in forecasting and modelling the UK economy than anyone else. And then again, you had the IMF, the
Tiny little
OECD,
Thunderbird
investment banks. So I don't think there was any...
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Could you slow down a little bit? I think
Sorry, I was taking your steer to move along. Sorry, I misinterpreted the
I didn't
signal.
tell you to go so fast. We can't keep
So
up.
I think my point would be
concise.
there was
Don't speak
considerable
fast. Don't waffle
information
fast.
about the
Be
economic
concise.
impacts on the economy in the public domain, not just from HMT, but many other independent expert bodies. So even if this specific advice on a micro point wasn't published, there was a lot of evidence out there. Look, is it possible that HMT could have published even more? Perhaps. I think
You bemoan in the article in The Spectator the absence of cost-benefit calculations. You say a basic requirement for pretty much every public health intervention, but this was never made. What did you mean by that?
Again, I think I'm just agreeing with something that one of the epidemiologists has subsequently said, that the cost benefit in a precise way wasn't done. I think you talked about it, Mr. Keith, in our early conversation about March, where it just was happening very quickly. I mentioned Quayle analysis before. You told me not to mention it, but that would be an example of a cost benefit analysis that has been used in other aspects of healthcare, and indeed independent academics used it to evaluate the benefits and costs of the first lockdown. That was the broader point I was making.
There was, it appears from the evidence of Claire Lombardelli,
What a shit
at the
kicker.
beginning of the pandemic, no pre-existing model of how a pandemic would affect the economy. There was no material showing what the estimated costs would be likely to be, of course. But during the course of the pandemic, did you instruct the Treasury to start preparing cost-benefit calculations on account of your view that those sorts of analyses were simply not there?
I think that would be more a function for the Cabinet Office and the task force, and that's exactly what you would expect the task force to, over time, be able to do, which is to synthesise the different things from different areas and try and bring them together. So that's really what the task force over time was able to do a better job at.
Mr. Sunak, the HMT is a wizard in the field of fiscal and economic matters and cost-benefit analyses. You can't bemoan in The Spectator, on one hand, the absence of any calculation along those lines, and then say that it's something that you expect the Cabinet Office to have done. Why didn't the Treasury say the government would be hugely assisted by calculations that bring together the cost-benefit thinking about future lockdowns? Let's do it.
Because I think it's an incredibly hard thing to do. I think we shouldn't just assume that it was available off the shelf to just do. These are incredibly complex decisions, and in many cases very hard to quantify. I mean, many health decisions are trade-offs. I mean, how do you think about quantifying? Well, we do it with drugs, often with Quayle analysis, but the moral dimensions to these things is very complex. My point is the Cabinet Office, the task force is the right place to bring together different aspects of it. Now, actually Treasury seconded 10 people to the task force, particularly to help with all of this. And again, I think a reflection on all of this for the future is if someone has developed a better way to integrate these things, then that's something that expertise one would ideally like to have next time around. But I'm not sure that it's that straightforward. I think you can do illustrative cost-benefit analyses, as indeed the academics who produced the Quayle paper did, but we shouldn't pretend that you could reduce all these things to a simple number that the Prime Minister can just see and then make a decision based on it. It will never be that straightforward.
Well, indeed. And I don't think anybody has suggested that. Could we now look, please, at the winter strategy briefly and September, October? The winter strategy document of the 19th of September made plain that the infection was spreading rapidly. The 7-day average of confirmed cases had risen from 1,077 in mid-August to 3,598 today. That's the 19th of September. And is on a sharp upward trajectory. And there are references to what the hospital admissions might be if no further measures are implemented. As a general rule, and I'm sure you would accept this proposition, the Treasury briefed you. We can see a briefing for a COVID Strategy Committee, COVID-S meeting on the 21st of September, to oppose a circuit breaker. Obviously, a proposal for circuit breakers was what was being discussed, on the basis that the Treasury feared that a circuit breaker of perhaps 2 to 3 weeks wouldn't itself be enough if that was the route that would be pursued. And also there was a risk that if it was only 2 to 3 weeks, the government might find itself in the awful position of coming out of a circuit breaker whilst the number of deaths is still going in the wrong direction. So there were good arguments to be made against circuit breaker. You made them, did you not?
Yes, I was never particularly persuaded by the circuit breaker, as indeed others weren't either.
And it's fair to say that at the meeting of COVID-S on the 21st of September and also the COBRA and Cabinet meetings on the 22nd, you presented analysis from HMT showing how a circuit breaker would hit the hospitality sector incredibly hard with consequential damage to its vulnerable workforce. That's all very obvious. In the course of Professor Sir Chris Whitty's oral evidence, he said this in response to a question: had there perhaps been a circuit breaker in September, and perhaps a tier-level system introduced earlier and had time to work over a longer period of time, would there remain the possibility that the second lockdown might not have been necessary? He said yes, or might have not been as long. And he says, I think most people would say that's the case. So that we're absolutely clear, there was nothing wrong with opposing a circuit breaker. The government was in a very, very difficult position, and the arguments were extremely finely balanced between damage to the economy and the public health considerations in terms of rising infection. Is that obvious?
Yes, it was obviously a finely balanced decision. Indeed, the CSA and the CMO used that phrase, I think, at a press conference at the time.
They
and
did.
It was also the case that SAGE themselves said that the evidence base on which to judge the effectiveness and harms associated with different interventions was weak at that moment in time, and that policymakers would have to consider a whole range of impacts alongside the epidemiological impacts. So that was the context of the discussion at the time, even from the medical and scientific advisors and the kinds of things that they were saying. Indeed, I think the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, as late as the end of October, about the 20th of October, himself in a press conference said that he didn't think a national fire break was the right policy, and that was a month after the deliberations that we're talking about at the end of September.
There was a meeting on the 20th of September in Downing Street or Chequers, I can't recall where the Prime Minister met with, you'll recall because you were there, Professors Edmonds and McLean and Professor Gupta, Professor Hennigan and Anders Tegnell of Sweden. Did you reflect upon why that meeting was being called, given the government's stated position that it would follow the science, by which it presumably meant its own chief medical officer and governmental chief scientific advisor?
I wasn't responsible for organising the meeting, so you have to, I guess whoever organised it would be the person to ask.
Did you express views in the meeting in support of Professor Hennigan and Professor Gupta's stated position, which was essentially that there was no requirement for there to be a lockdown, and that in the general scheme of things, a lockdown would be an overreaction, massively damaging and epidemiologically not required?
I don't have any strong recollections of the meeting. It was a Prime Minister wanting to hear from a range of different scientists and get their views, some domestic and one from Sweden, as you mentioned.
You must have asked yourself on a particularly intense time, why am I attending this meeting to hear the views of scientists who are outside the range of, well, I suppose the consensus range of evidential advice that was being received from SAGE?
It didn't strike me as odd, and I think entirely reasonable for the Prime Minister to seek a diversity of opinion as he's coming to make decisions. A question for him, really, more than me. I was invited to a meeting. I went to a meeting, but I don't think there's anything wrong with hearing from a range of people. I think that's a healthy process, and if some people, there's long evidence in behavioural psychology about people getting into groupthink, and the Prime Minister, if he wants to get out of consensus views, again, inherently, there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think, or the fact that they want from the UK.
Mr. Sunak, so that we don't have an unnecessary hair run, I'm not suggesting that it was wrong to seek that advice. I'm merely asking you whether or not you wondered why you had been asked to attend alongside that scientific advice from the range, the spectrum from which it derived. You didn't think about it?
No.
All right. The tier system, we can deal with this very briefly because it is obvious that there were a number of meetings in front of COVID-S to consider the recommendation from the COVID task force that there be a tier system. You discussed on the 8th of October with the Prime Minister directly the health and economic arguments, and then following that day, I think perhaps that night or the next day, the Cabinet Secretary briefed officials that you and the Prime Minister had agreed that the government would seek to negotiate the restrictions which were a necessary part of the tier process. Mr. Hancock has said in evidence that he knew at the time of the announcement of the tiered system on the 12th of October that it wouldn't work. What was your view as to the likelihood that this tier system, which, to remind ourselves, of course, was imposed from the 12th of October and required these detailed local negotiations to take place, would work? Did you have a view on it?
I think, well, the strong, I'd say strong maybe, the general consensus, I think, amongst our medical and scientific advisors on going into the autumn was that a local approach was the right approach. You can see that in the SAGE minutes consistently from the end of June. They talk about an emphasis on local control. I remember the chief medical officer in cabinet, either at the beginning of October or end of September, making the point that actually the UK's national outbreak in the first wave had been an exception to the pattern across Europe, where Italy and Spain in particular had seen more localised outbreaks. And I think he said in the minutes it's recorded that it's possible the second wave will be localised. And again, that even once we ended up going into a second, I think the proof is here actually, even once we ended up going into a second national lockdown, the cabinet minutes, I think from the 10th of November, reflect the CMO's views that reintroducing the tiered system after the national measures seemed entirely rational. So I think the strong point of view of everybody was that a local approach was sensible to try. He thought that even after we'd gone into a national lockdown. I think.
Forgive me, you referred to the SAGE minutes consistently from the end of June. By October and the time of the introduction of the tier system, the CMO and the GCSA had made it absolutely plain that this would simply not suffice to reduce the R below 1, and that the only epidemiologically justified route was a more stringent circuit breaker or lockdown. The position had changed, had it not by October.
Well, in the minutes of the 20th of October cabinet meeting, the CMO is recorded as saying that the country remains split into three broad categories. This justified the government's approach of 3 tiers of local alert level.
Yes.
So that's in the cabinet minutes on the 20th of October.
And at that meeting and on the 11th of October, he made it plain that epidemiologically there was a very high risk that the tier system would not work to bring R below 1. You were aware of that?
I said on the 20th of October, he said that it justified the government's approach of 3 tiers at a local alert level. That's in the cabinet minutes on the 20th of October.
All right.
And even after the national lockdown, as I said, he said that it would be entirely rational to reintroduce the tiering system.
Yes, but that,
so
of course, is after the lockdown.
But I'm saying it goes to the point that the principle of a tiered system is one which had, I think, wide support amongst scientific and health advisors.
We may be at cross purposes.
Yes, I feel
Obviously,
we are.
there is a justification for a tier system within its own parameters. But was it not apparent that it was, bluntly, a bit of a chance as to whether or not epidemiologically it would work?
Right. Well,
I mean, there is a system in place concerning the negotiations.
No, I understand your
which were
question.
difficult.
Well, in which case I would just point you to the remarks of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer on the 20th of October in the press conference, where he was asked, and he said, this national fire break you talk about, no, I don't think that's right, and I don't think that it's consistent with the epidemiological picture we are seeing. I think it would be very difficult to justify. The chief medical, I think not the chief medical officer, but maybe the medical director at the NHS also made a point after that in the same press conference about the varied epidemiological impact they were seeing around the country in hospitals. So at the end of October, exactly on the date that you're talking about, in public, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer was saying that he didn't think national action would be justified given the varied epidemiological picture across the country. And that was backed up, I think, by Steve Powis in the same press conference.
Forgive me, in the Cabinet and the COVID-S meetings which you attended as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you were aware that epidemiologically this was a bit of a chance. It was quite likely it would not work to bring R below 1, but it was, in policy terms, a position open to the government to take and one that you supported, because, of course, you would be violently opposed to a lockdown.
I think that's not a fair characterisation of my position. I was opposed to a circuit breaker in September because I didn't think it would have achieved its stated objectives, something that I think most people now acknowledge to be the case, and I've seen in evidence people now accepting that it wouldn't have prevented the need for a second lockdown. Indeed, it didn't work in Wales when it was tried. So I was specifically opposed to a circuit breaker, again, as... I think violently opposed to lockdowns is not an accurate characterisation of my position at that time. I was opposed to the circuit breaker on its own merits because I didn't think it would work. Now, at the end of October, we can both quote minutes back at each other. I'm looking at a cabinet minute from the 20th of October where the chief medical officer is saying that it was justified.
What was your position, Mr. Sunak, by the 30th of October in relation to the lockdown decision of the 4th of November?
As the minutes show, that I didn't oppose it at the end of into November. I didn't oppose that lockdown, but what I can tell you that it was reasonable to believe at the end of October that the regional approach may still work. That was a reasonable belief. Now, obviously, it turned out not to be right with the benefit of hindsight, but when you have the Deputy Chief Medical Officer themselves saying at the end of October that he doesn't believe that national action is warranted because it wasn't consistent with the varied regional picture we're seeing, that demonstrates to you that reasonable people believed that the regional approach may still work and it was worth trying. Now, clearly, in the event, it didn't. But as we discussed earlier, these things were finely balanced, lots of things to think about. But was it a reasonable approach at the time? I think so, and it was extensively debated. So in terms of thinking about the decision-making process, even if the decision might be one that in hindsight people would revisit, I don't think there was any failure in the process because it was extensively debated in government.
Do we take it from that you had every opportunity to dissuade the Prime Minister from the ultimate decision to impose a lockdown in November 2020? You were heard, your voice was listened to, but ultimately the Prime Minister, in effect, decided that there had to be a lockdown.
It was always the case that decisions ultimately laid with the Prime Minister. That's the same throughout. And my job throughout, as I've said, was to make him aware of the impacts of the decisions. And I always felt that I had that opportunity.
Did you specifically say to him, Prime Minister, my position as the Chancellor of the Exchequer is a lockdown is not warranted for all the reasons that this inquiry understands and for all the reasons reflected in the paperwork before you and before this inquiry? In that ultimate debate, your view was, I think this is the wrong decision.
No.
Is that what you told him?
No, the debate, and as I think the record shows and the evidence shows, the point I made to him, which he did consider but ultimately disagreed with me on, was to consider whether it was necessary to shut non-essential retail as part of that lockdown. That's what the record shows. I put that. The Prime Minister, I think, said he wanted to think over that. He ended up deciding that it was worth shutting it down because by this point we had the evidence from SAGE that confirmed the very minimal impact on R from closing non-essential retail. So by this point we had that data. So I said, reasonable to consider whether that was necessary given the impact it would have on those people's jobs. Doesn't have any impact on R as far as we're being told. Prime Minister thought about it, decided to include it in the lockdown for simplicity or whatever. I don't know why exactly, but the simplicity of the overall approach. But that was my main specific point about that decision, was purely on non-essential retail.
All right.
And that is, I think, recorded in all the evidence that you have.
It is. 3 final questions, please. Firstly,
Questions? Is he vapid off?
inappropriately and unattractively, there is material which shows that the Treasury was pejoratively associated with death. Some officials in number 10 described the Treasury as the pro-death squad, obviously on account of the fact that the Treasury was seen to be opposed to maximum public health interventions and was quite properly, as we've established, promoting the issue of the need to avoid economic and societal damage and harm. Were you aware that the Treasury was being referred to in those terms? You may not have been aware.
I wasn't, and I do not think it is a fair characterisation.
Indeed.
On the incredibly hard-working people that I was lucky to be supported by at the Treasury, and in the same way earlier you talked about the people at SAGE being motivated by doing what they thought was best in the public interest. I would say exactly the same about all the people who worked with me at the Treasury, who worked extremely hard throughout the entire period. And as you kindly alluded to earlier in the IFG report, are widely considered to have done some things that no one had thought possible, that saved millions of people's livelihoods and helped the economy get through, and therefore help families get through and support the country through a difficult time. I'm grateful to them for what they did, and I said I don't think that is a fair characterisation of how they approach their jobs at all.
Indeed. It is obvious that many of the very difficult decisions which had to be taken by government were themselves highly politicised. They are decisions which engage the public. They have given rise to an enormous amount of public anxiety as well as public heat and light, and it's obvious that the government acted whenever it acted in good faith and doing the best that it possibly could. That is its stated position, and there's no basis for challenging that. One particularly contentious issue is the issue of free meals in holidays. You'll recall, Prime Minister, that Marcus Rashford, the footballer, spearheaded a campaign, Make the U-Turn campaign. He campaigned for holiday food vouchers for children who were entitled to free school meals. And an extract from Sir Patrick Vallance's diary refers to a meeting on the 13th of June 2021 when this issue came up. And Sir Patrick has suggested that somebody at the meeting said, good working people pay for their children to eat and don't want freeloaders. And he has suggested that in the context of, I don't need it up on the screen, thank you very much, in the context of the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Chief Whip. Plainly, you couldn't both have said it if anybody said it. But I want you to please answer whether or not anybody did say those words and whether you recollect anybody using them.
I did not say those words. I don't recollect anyone saying those words. And my concern throughout the pandemic was making sure that we had support in place for the most vulnerable. And I think, as all the evidence now shows, and as independent analysts such as those at the Resolution Foundation have said, that our schemes actually helped the most financially vulnerable the most. Poverty fell, unemployment remained low. The distributional analysis published by the Treasury again supports that it was the poorest households who were protected the most by what I and the government did throughout this time, because people who were least well off were uppermost in our thoughts throughout this time, because we knew it would be particularly difficult on them, and that's why we put a range of things in place to help them, and I'm glad that the evidence shows that they did get the most support.
Prime Minister, thank you.
Should we take the break now?
Please.
I shall return in 25 past.
All rise.
All right. Hello there. Hello. Right. So we are going to rejoin the COVID inquiry. Like they say, we're going to rejoin it at 25 past, I think they said. So I'm going to leave the COVID inquiry thing up for a few minutes. I'll just catch up with your messages. There's a lot of good stuff coming in. I try to read out as many as I can, but it's hard to get a word in without talking over either Hugo Keith or Rishi Sunak, and I don't want to kind of annoy you too much. So I'm going to go and get another cup of tea in my Labour Social mug, which you can get using the link below, along with a mug that says, I voted Brexit because I'm a mug, which you can buy for the Brexits are in your life. Also, there's a copy of the Great Brexit Cookbook down there, the new edition of it, which has got a dead pigeon on the front. This one's got a bull's head. There's a great recipe in here for like a boiled pig's head, I think. Probably our friend David Cameron, our new foreign minister, would probably quite like, I would imagine. We've got tongue toast in there. Look at that, tongue toast, if you want to make some lovely tongue toast. We've got kidney stewed. We've got beef kidney, rissoles. We've got loads of kidney stuff. We've got lots of rabbit dishes. We've got gelatine of rabbit. We've also got some of my favourites in here. We've got roasted seagull there, and we've also got sparrow stew. So all all the goodness of Brexit. Culinary Brexit, none of that foreign muck. It's all British stuff. Nettle soup, bone broth. Got some really nice desserts here. Semolina patties, cabbage farce, meat gatto. Oh, lovely. These are all genuine recipes from the Victorian era. True story. But yes, Megan Leeds happily kindly put a link in the description there, the Great Brexit Cookbook. You can also get it from Waterstones as well if you don't want to buy stuff from Amazon, which is fair enough. So I'll just read what it says on the back. It says, discover the true flavour of Brexit. Whether you voted for your grandchildren to feel the icy chill and gnawing hunger of what we thought were bygone winters because you hate them, or because you were too stupid to see how you were being played like a cheap piano by the privately educated elite, this book is for you. Now that we've imposed crippling trade sanctions on ourselves as if we just lost a major war and rid our majestic kingdom of them pesky foreigners who came over here and did all the jobs we didn't want to do, we are finally free to eat the god-awful food of our once and glorious past. Cheap and tasteless dishes of low nutritional value, such as stewed pigeon, bone soup, and boiled sheep's head. May the miserable and restrictive future that you have voted to foist on your offspring taste as delicious as the dishes contained within. Curse there, but yeah, the great Brexit cookbook. Put that together last year while I was supposed to be writing the second book of my trilogy about traveling to every country in the world without flying, which still isn't finished. I'm doing a George R. R. Martin, only with fewer people waiting for my next part of the saga. But we're planning to start on January the 1st doing an Odyssey 50 years on. 50. I'm not that old. 15 years on, and revisiting my old Odyssey blogs each day and adding new videos. Never seen before footage that's going to be put on my Graham Hughes Travels channel, which is going to run alongside Labour Social. I don't know when I'm going to have time to sleep, but break time or just cooking with Graham? Indeed, it's break time. That's break time. Roasted 50 quid cocaine straws. Anyone? Excellent for that Tory Coke moment, says DJ Burp. No, there's none of that. It's all Victorian recipes, real Victorian recipes. Sparrow, and seagull, and dead rat. I don't know if there's a rat recipe in there. You getting a HBO show? No, Stephen. If only. So lucky this is not the main news. Rwanda is the main news. If both were separate days, you would have created more headache. Well, yeah, we're going to have the vote on Rwanda tomorrow, but today in the Star Chamber, they think it sounds cool. The Star Chamber, which is a collection of lawyers that are working for the government, that they've had a look at this, the Rwanda policy, and says it doesn't go far enough. And the ERG, the European Research Group, the hilariously named ERG, they've said that they don't know whether they're going to support it or not. Their plan will be that I think they will support it, and I'll tell you why. They'll think that they will. I think they will support it so they can put amendments in the bill next year. So that might be the plan. Whereas if they all oppose it now, then that's the Rwanda scheme just dead in the water, and they would have wasted the best part of £300 million on nothing, which is par for the course for the Tories. What can I say? If Labour wins, can we have Hughes of the World back? Yes, Aaron. I'm planning to get. It's more time, basically. At the moment, I'm running everything on Labour Social. Obviously, I've got the help of Phil Morehouse, but he's got his own channel to run as well. So hopefully, in the new year, if I can get someone else to come on board with me on this venture, who can actually do the admin side of things. So doing the thumbnails, doing the re-editing the videos so we can put them on TikTok and for YouTube Shorts and things like that, because I've got time to make the videos and write the videos and present the videos, but having time to edit them afterwards, I do have 2 small children to look after as well as doing all this. So, like I said, there's not enough hours in the day, especially if I'm going to do daft things like trot off to Ukraine for a few days to deliver presents to adorable little cherubs over there. We've got pictures back of the kids getting their presents, and some of them are so cute. It's ridiculous. And I feel like a big ginger Santa. Big ginger Santa dropping off presents, which I couldn't have done without your support. So thank you very much for everyone who supported our run to Ukraine last week. Anyway, so I'm going to go. I'll make myself another cup of tea. I'm going to leave you in the safe, capable hands of this screen. And if it comes back on before I get back to the table here, to the desk, then fair enough. I came back from making coffee, and Graham has become a giant in the House of Commons. I'm not a giant. I was just close to the screen, but now I'm tiny Graham again. But now I'm going to disappear, like as if by magic. But I'll be back in a few minutes, furnished with a new brew. Until then, I'll see you in a moment. Bye.
Given the time and obviously the Prime Minister's other commitments, I'm afraid I'm going to have to be particularly tough on call participants questioning this afternoon. First of all, Mr Weatherby. No, it's not Mr Weatherby, it's Miss Morris.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Sunak, I ask questions on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And I've been given permission to ask questions on one topic, and that is financial support for care home workers. So I'm going to put a short number of propositions to you from the evidence already before the Chair, and I'm going to ask you 2 short questions about them. First of all, the inquiry has already heard from Mr Hancock, and according to his second statement, it had been realised by early June 2020 that agency workers moving from one care home to another was a key pathway through which the virus was entering care homes to devastating effect. According to him, at a COVID-0 meeting on the 15th of September 2020, it was agreed that regulations would be brought in to prohibit staff movement between care homes as a matter of law. And the proposals were drafted and then went out for consultation. By December 2020, he described how DHSC had finalised proposals which included a compensation package for such workers' foregone hours, which required Treasury agreement. That's clearly where I'm going to ask you about your involvement. However, Mr Hancock said at, just for the record, paragraph 491 of his second statement, that it, quote, became clear that HMT was reticent to fund a scheme to support staff affected by the proposed regulation, and that the implementation of the plan was delayed again. And in fact, he uses the word opposition in the same paragraph. According to a later DHSC submission to Mr Hancock on the 5th of January, this time 2021, it noted that HMT ministers decided not to fund the compensation scheme, saying it was the wrong mechanism, but they are open to options to support increased staff supply. And Mr Hancock described how in the event the proposed regulations to restrict the movement of workers were not brought forward due to the lack of compensation and workforce shortages at that stage. So my first question is, what was your involvement in this process, Mr Sunak? And what was the reluctance and reticence?
Well, the first thing to say that, in particular, from the beginning of the pandemic, I was cognizant that this would have an enormous impact on the NHS and social care workforce, family and organisations, which is why we put an enormous amount of funding in place to support them. Now, obviously, for social care, that largely goes through local authorities. So one of the earliest things we did was provide billions of pounds extra for local authorities in unring-fenced grants so that they would have extra funds to spend on the things that they needed to at the time. And that was done, I can't remember exactly what date, but relatively early on in the pandemic. Now, with regard to social care in particular, I wasn't, and I don't have any strong recollection of these sets of conversations. I wasn't primarily involved with them to the best of my knowledge. I think you referenced in advice that said HMT ministers.
Ministers, yes.
Yeah, the person responsible, which I think is clear from the documented evidence, was the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And he's the minister responsible for spending. And he was the one that was going back and forth with the Department for Health on the various options that were available. I think in the Department for Health advice, I haven't got the exact date, it says CST considered funding an alternative proposal, not convinced the policy will achieve its aim. And also the DH advice was that whether to proceed when we nearly have the vaccine was already in the balance. Yeah. So I know that there were conversations happening between the Chief Secretary and the department. They were not ones that I was cited on or involved in.
So in short, did it cross your desk?
Not to my recollection, and having reviewed best I can some of the evidence at the time with the Treasury, as said, these specific 2 proposals on compensation mechanisms and things were dealt with by him. In the event, I think a general fund was established at some point for the social care workforce specifically around this time, but again, it wasn't something that I was directly involved in.
The question I have is specifically aimed around this period between the end of 2020 and prior to January 2021. And my second question is this, that given that staff movement was a primary contributor to care home infections, and according to the Department of Health, still a key infection prevention and control concern at a time of increased incidence, why was there still no mechanism to incentivise and or to compensate care home staff to confine themselves to working in one care home by January 2021?
Well, I think if I check the details, I think there was some new funding announced on the 16th of January, and the CST had considered a proposal from DH about a general fund to boost the social care workforce, and had approved it, and it was precisely to support providers to restrict staff movement between care homes and other care settings, etc., etc. So I think that those conversations were happening and a fund was announced, as far as I can tell. But again, it wasn't something that I was directly involved in. That was the Chief Secretary to the Treasury's primary responsibility.
And you'd agree from the documents that you're referring to and that I'm referring to that wasn't in place before January 2021, despite the conversations taking place between the departments and the Chief Secretary for the Treasury?
Yes, I don't remember these conversations, again, happening until immediately before then anyway, having reviewed this pack from the Treasury. It sounded like those conversations were predominantly happening in and around December, with an announcement in January.
Okay.
And I think there's another point that's worth making, that in the end, I think key system partners no longer supported it, and that's something that I think the Secretary of State for Health and his officials have also said in their evidence. It wasn't just the funding, it was actually the mechanics of making it work, I think, weren't, as I said, key system partners no longer supported it, was the conclusion they had come to as well.
But one of the reasons the regulations was not put in place by that point was because of the lack of financial package. Would you agree with that?
I don't, I said, it's not something that I was directly involved in. And I think there were separate regulations that had been considered. But again, it was not something that I was actively involved in. So it's hard for me to comment much beyond what I've said.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. Those are my questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Morris. Ms Harris.
That really didn't achieve very much, did it?
No.
And you're right.
It's
it
Ms
just looked
Gowan,
like it.
exactly.
He looks at his notes.
Sunak, I don't know if you can see Ms Gowan. If
I
you
can.
Look around the pillar.
No, I can.
Sorry about the pillars.
Thank you, my lady. Prime Minister, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. And my questions relate to the UK government's interactions with the devolved administrations, and in particular the Welsh Government. My first topic relates to the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and you've already explained in your evidence that the devolved administrations were not consulted. Did the devolved administrations, and specifically the Welsh Government, have the option of opting out of the scheme? And if not, why not?
No.
I'm not sure whether that was something that was ever raised with me. To be honest, I don't recall receiving any form of permission from the Welsh Government to do that.
No, that wasn't the question.
And if there is, I'd be happy to see it, but it's not something that I.
That wasn't the question
at the time.
Could they opt out?
So, if you have it, I'd be happy to have a look at it.
Could
but I don't
they
recall them
opt
ever
out?
Making a formal
Answer
submission
the
to
question
opt
that
out
was
of the scheme.
asked.
Was that not indicative of the lack of consultation with them in the first place, though?
No, because as we have a devolution settlement where obviously the UK government is able to make policy on matters that are reserved, and devolved governments make matters on policy which is devolved. Right, I wouldn't expect them to consult me on things that they were doing that were within their devolved competence every time they were making a budget decision. Ordinarily, again, they wouldn't expect to consult the UK government on that. That's how our devolution settlement works. But I said I don't recall them ever, after announcement of the scheme, and as we've discussed, there was almost a month between announcement and commencement, them formally saying to me or the Treasury that they wanted to not participate in the scheme. I don't think they ever did that. I don't recall them doing so.
I think, Prime Minister, you've answered my second question on that topic, but did the Welsh Government have the opportunity, in your view, to raise concerns if they had concerns?
I think that they always have an opportunity, and they frequently do. So if that was something that they wanted to raise, I'm sure they would have raised it through the normal channels that they had.
Thank you. My second topic relates to the funding of public health decisions in Wales during the pandemic. And I'm going to put two particular paragraphs that are contained within the first witness statement of the First Minister for Wales, Mr Mark Drakeford's statement. This is Exhibit 273747, page 40. Before we turn to Mr Drakeford's statement, it's important to set out two points of context that you set out within your witness statement. You say in your statement that the UK government provides most of the devolved administration's funding with quantum to be determined by the Barnett formula. And you also say that the UK government provided the devolved administrations with an upfront funding guarantee in July 2021, and that was further uplifted on 3 occasions to enable the devolved administrations greater flexibility to respond to the pandemic. And with those important points of context in mind, and turning to Mr Drakeford's statement, at paragraph 136 of the statement, he says this, and I hope that it's on the screen in front of you. On the 23rd of October 2020, the Welsh fire break came into effect. Had we had the confidence that the UK government would provide the money needed to support people during the fire break, we probably would have implemented the lockdown earlier. However, it was hard for Wales to take the initiative because that meant we had to take the decision without financial support provided by the UK government. Now, I'm not asking about the merits of the firebreak or otherwise, but do you agree with Mr Drakeford's views in respect of the lack of financial support?
No, I don't. We have a constitutional settlement in the UK whereby funding for devolved administrations comes either through their standard block grant, their own tax raising powers, but then also the Barnett formula. So when the UK government decides that it's increasing spending in areas of England, that triggers what are called Barnett consequentials or extra funding for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, because they're obviously funded at a larger level than in England. That is the constitutional settlement as it works. Because of the unprecedented nature of the pandemic, we actually did something different. Precisely to give devolved administrations extra financial flexibility and security, we gave them money in advance of that being triggered by a decision that might be taken with respect to England, precisely because we recognise that there would be some degree of iteration. That was introduced in July. There's never been done before. It's unprecedented, the upfront funding guarantee. It was uplifted 3 times, the first time of which was in early October, so just before this period. In total, it was extra £5 billion for Wales, which is a significant amount. So they had total freedom to spend that money as they wished. And so that money was available beyond their existing. Again, they have tax raising powers and borrowing powers that they can use if they want to raise extra funding. But as I said, we had provided in an unprecedented fashion money in advance of it being constitutionally triggered to give them extra financial flexibility.
I think, Mr Sunak, it was the 9th of October that the first uplift was implemented. Yes. Is that right?
Yes, the upfront funding guarantee was introduced in July. It was then uplifted 3 times, the first of which was on the 9th of October, so just before these conversations.
Thank you.
And again, that's funding, just so we're clear, at that moment, that would be the Welsh or Scottish or Northern Ireland governments receiving funding before it had been triggered through something that the UK government had done. So the constitutional settlement doesn't normally work like that, but that was government saying, we want you to have extra money. We don't know if actually this will ever come to pass. It may well, but we want to give you that extra certainty now. We'd never done that before, and so we did it, and then we uplifted it 3 times, including just before this particular moment.
And you said in your evidence as well that Wales and indeed all of the devolved administrations had their own tax-raising powers in addition to any of the additional funding that would have been made available by the UK government.
Yes, I was giving an explanation more generally of how the funding settlements work and borrowing powers as well. There was a bit of a primer in there about how devolved funding works in general.
Thank you. Moving on, in a similar vein, Mr Drakeford goes on at paragraph 138 of his statement to say that October 2020 was a challenging month for intergovernmental relations. And then at paragraph 139, he concludes as follows. The Chancellor of the Exchequer refused to fund the consequences of a public health decision taken in Wales. That decision was, in my view, one of the most misguided decisions of the whole pandemic. Yeah. It demonstrated that the 4 nations of the UK were to be treated differently by HM Treasury.
Yep.
It was, in effect, acting as a treasury for England, not a treasury for the UK. This was vividly illustrated when, within a few days of the Welsh firebreak, a similar set of measures were adopted for England. Funds to support that cause of action were then released by the UK Treasury. Those funds were extended to Wales, but only because of decisions taken in response to the public health position in England, not because of the public health needs in Wales. So the same question, Mr Sunak, do you agree with Mr Drakeford's views? Is he being fair?
No, I don't. It's the same answer I gave before. It precisely had funded extra money for Wales in early October in advance of that being triggered as is normal. And I think actually what the UK government demonstrated through the pandemic, that there was incredible benefit to the people in Wales and indeed Scotland and Northern Ireland of being part of the United Kingdom, because the UK as an entity had the balance sheet strength to fund what were unprecedented interventions like the furlough scheme, which benefited, I haven't got the exact numbers in front of me, but a considerable number of people in Wales and indeed in Scotland and Northern Ireland. That was just one of many UK measures implemented, indeed the increase in universal credit, much of the support elsewhere extended through the welfare system, all of which benefited people in Wales. So that was the UK government delivering for people across the UK, and as I said, money was made available for Wales in advance of need because of the way that we structured the upfront funding guarantee. And again, it was not ring-fenced. It was up to the Welsh Government to decide how to spend that money.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Those are my questions. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Ms Garman. Ms Mitchell. Ms Mitchell's over there.
Prime Minister, I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. You've given evidence this morning in relation to the difficult job of balancing economic consequences of the pandemic with the decisions that have to be taken on health by those who have to make those decisions. Health obviously being a devolved matter, the First Minister of Scotland was tasked with that responsibility, and the funding of that matter rested with the UK Government. Can I have inquiry number 217057 up, please? This is a letter from the then First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Page 1, just for the date, we get that date on 23rd September 2020, and can we go to the top of page 2? Now, I appreciate you won't have received this letter directly unless it was forwarded on to you, but what this says on that date, the 23rd September, is, and third, if it's not possible to reach a Four Nations agreement on further restrictions with associated support, what arrangements can be put in place to ensure that devolved administrations are not constrained in making what we judge to be essential public health decisions because we lack the financial flexibility to provide support to affected sectors or individuals? Now, you've already touched, obviously, on that issue with my learned friend who's already asked you questions. The first question I would like to ask you about this was, were you made aware either by Mr Johnston or Mr Gove as to the concerns the First Minister had at that time?
Yeah, I can't recall this specific letter.
You may not recall the specific letter, but were you made aware of concerns either by Mr Johnston or Mr Gove about that particular concern of the First Minister?
Not in a specific sense. I think in general there were conversations throughout the pandemic about points of difference with the DAs, but I can't remember any specificity around those conversations at this particular time or more generally.
Yeah, because I'm keen to explore the timescales that you've identified, because I think you mentioned July 2020 in your answer to my learned friend, and I'm wondering if July 2020 is the correct time, because it seems both Mr Drakeford and Ms Sturgeon were expressing concerns much later than that the issue hadn't been raised and dealt with.
The reason I mentioned July is because July was the first time that the upfront funding guarantee was put in place. So it was as early as July, in fact, before these conversations, that the UK government had decided to do something unprecedented, which is to provide extra funding to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in advance of that funding being triggered constitutionally through the Barnett formula. And then that funding was uplifted 3 times subsequently to that. The first of those uplifts was in October.
Indeed, it would appear, though...
I mean, so shortly, I think shortly after this letter, by the look of things.
Yes,
actually.
indeed, it would appear, though, notwithstanding what you've told us about, there were still concerns in relation to both the Scottish Government and also the Welsh Government in relation to this particular issue. What I'm saying is that after the arrangements had been put in place that had been made, were you aware of these further particular concerns in relation to the quandary that Scotland and Wales found itself in questions of making decisions on public health that might require additional public funding, for example, funding that might be different from that?
I'm not sure I agree with the sequencing. I thought the date, if you can flick back to the first page of the letter.
That letter can be placed up on the screen.
If you just flick back to the...
Indeed.
Yeah, so that was on the 23rd of September. So actually, 2 weeks after that, there was an uplift in the upfront funding guarantee. So again, I wasn't familiar with this particular letter, but
forgive me, Prime
subsequent
Minister.
to that, if there was a concern raised anyway, there was action in early October to increase the funding to the Scottish Government beyond its, at that point, as a constitutional amount that would be due. And again, I'd make the same point that I made previously, as we have an existing constitutional settlement.
Indeed, Prime Minister,
which obviously we acted in unprecedented fashion, but that is the constitutional settlement we have.
I'm not looking for that analysis. What I'm looking for is specifically just to ascertain whether or not, even in absence of the Barnett formula, so in absence of reacting to what was happening in the rest of the UK and uplifting the amount even in advance, I'm asking separately about the issue. If I can give an example, I don't need this to be put up, but for the purposes of the inquiry number 235213, the statement of Nicola Sturgeon, paragraphs 102 and 103. In her written evidence to this inquiry, Mr Sunak, she states that the Scottish Government had pressed for a more generous approach to financial support for those required to self-isolate. In particular, the Scottish Government analysis showed that the labour impact of requiring self-isolation was unequal. People who were able to work from home were unlikely to lose income as a result of complying with self-isolation, but people who were not able to work from home were more likely to face a loss of income if they self-isolated and did not attend the workforce. Yep. Firstly, I would like to ask you about this. What conversations did you have with the Scottish Government in relation to whether a more generous approach to financial support from those who could not work from home but required to self-isolate?
You said you wanted to think about this relationship absent the Barnett formula.
Yes.
I genuinely think that's hard to do. The Barnett formula is the way that UK government spending in reserved areas translates into devolved areas, translates into incremental spending in the devolved administrations. It's hard to abstract away from that. That is the entire basis of our constitutional financial settlement.
Indeed, but
and we operated it in a way that was more generous than it normally works in order to provide extra funding in advance to the devolved administrations for them to use as they wanted, on top of their own ability, if they wanted, to raise more money or indeed borrow money. They have flexibilities that were available to them to do that. And actually, in the Scottish Government's case, on more than one occasion, with the Barnett formula consequentials that they received from the UK government, they were able to implement policies that were more generous than those that had been implemented in England, because they were obviously making different choices, or that money was enabled them to do that. So I think that is important.
Mr.
You can't abstract away from it. I think that's the entire basis of how it works.
Well, that is the basis of how it works, but I think the difficulty was that in a pandemic, the First Minister was in charge of health and was asking the Prime Minister what assistance can we get rather than waiting for the rest of the UK if we want to?
And my point was the upfront guarantee was put in place precisely so that they didn't have to wait. The whole point about it was funding in advance of that funding being triggered by something consequent down the line. So it was precisely because of that that the upfront guarantee was put in place
and can I return
increased
to
regularly.
My question, which was, what conversations did you have with the Scottish Government in relation to the issue that was raised about the unequal labour impact of requiring self-isolation to those who could work from home and those who couldn't?
I don't recall any specific conversations. Most of the financial engagement with the DAs happens via the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and there's a standard finance minister's quadrilateral that happens at that level between the DA, finance ministers and the Chief Secretary. That happened, as I believe, regularly during the pandemic, which would be the forum for those discussions.
Were you aware that such analysis was done?
As I said, more generally, the UK government did implement a scheme for self-isolation payments, and right at the early part of the pandemic, I introduced a scheme to support those who are self-employed.
I'm asking about the specific issue of inequality between those who could work from home, who self-isolated, and those who couldn't. Were you aware of that inequality, and were you aware of that problem?
I think I guess self-evident that there would be an inequality between those things. I would just, by definition, if you can work from home, obviously you would be less impacted by self-isolation requirements.
And was there anything done in that regard to try and equalise that inequality?
As I said, we introduced extra payments for people who are self-isolating. And we obviously introduced considerable economic support more generally for people's jobs and livelihoods, which, as I touched on in my evidence earlier, was disproportionately focused on the most vulnerable and has been demonstrated to have achieved that aim in helping those on the lowest incomes the most.
Finally, in your evidence, you've indicated that you've reflected upon your time as Chancellor and you've spoken of lessons learned and reflections. We know that prior to this pandemic, we've not heard any evidence of prior economic pandemic planning, despite it being highest risk on the National Risk Register. What provisions do you think should be put in place to allow the devolved administrations in the event of the next pandemic to access additional funding, to allow schemes, for example, such as furlough and those that we've talked about, to be put in place when they're required in those parts of the UK, but not required in England, i.e. when the Barnett formula isn't triggered?
I think that speaks to our overall constitutional and devolution settlement, and I think it's quite hard to completely unpick that. It may speak to it may speak to a need to do more things on a UK-wide basis next time around. The upfront guarantee system, I actually think, worked relatively well in providing that funding in advance to devolved administrations. And as I said, at broadly, over the course of the pandemic, most things happened at similar places, at similar times. I think that if you step back from all the debates and discussion, broadly, that is what happened, as my general recollection of the time during it.
And therefore, of those lessons learned, you think that broadly there isn't a need to change anything?
I said, well, obviously the inquiry will no doubt have helpful suggestions, but from an economic support perspective, which was my role at the time, I'm confident that the economic support that we put in place achieved its objectives. It protected millions of people's jobs, livelihoods and businesses, and it did so in a way that disproportionately benefited the most vulnerable across the United Kingdom, and that's something that I'm proud of, and I'm glad it worked. Obviously, I'm sure there will be helpful suggestions as to how to improve on it in the future.
But you yourself don't have any helpful solutions that you could give the inquiry?
Well, obviously, this module is not concerned with the economic decisions that I made, and no doubt I will be back to give extensive evidence on all of those. This was about decision-making structures and processes, but with regard to that and the devolved administration, again, as I said, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury is the one that maintains the quadrilateral framework of finance ministers. That's always been the case. I think generally has worked well when I was CST, and I think the upfront funding guarantee was a good innovation, and I'm glad we put it in place.
I may have questions for next time, but my lady, I'm obliged.
Thank you, Ms Mitchell. Mr Menon.
In the bin.
Mr Menon's over there,
innovation.
Prime Minister.
Good afternoon, Mr. Sunak. I ask questions on behalf of a number of children's rights organisations, and I want to return to the topic of the campaign for free meals for poorer school children during the summer holidays. Lee Kane, the former Downing Street Director of Communications, told the inquiry that the government's initial resistance in 2020 to Marcus Rashford's campaign for free meals for poorer school children during the summer holidays was a, quote, huge blunder, in that hungry children were not the right place to start showing public spending restraint from a moral or political standpoint.
Yes.
Given the government's subsequent U-turn on this issue, do you agree that Lee Kane was right about that?
Well, I can't remember the exact decision-making around that in any great detail, other than to know that ultimately the government spent, I think, about £500 million over the course of the pandemic funding free school meals. And then
almost on
I put in
Rwanda,
place
mate.
as
That's not gonna
Chancellor a
work.
permanent uplift in the provision for vulnerable
work.
children called the Holiday Activity and Food Programme, which is funded quite considerably to provide not just food but enriching activities for children during holiday times, obviously focused on the most disadvantaged children, and that is now a permanent feature post-pandemic of the support in place for vulnerable children in our country. And again, I just go back to what I said previously about our overall and my overall approach during the pandemic was very much focused on those on the lowest incomes, and as a result they rightly received disproportionately more help and benefited the most.
So are you saying that it was somebody else in government who was initially opposed to funding this, rather than you, the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
I can't recall the individual discussions.
What was your view in 2020 on this matter initially?
I generally can't
remember.
Generally can't recall the exact discussions. I mean, in the end, we did ultimately fund it. There was a discussion about term time and out of term time, because obviously those were different things. One hadn't been impacted by the pandemic. Ultimately, the government did fund quite considerably the free school meals programme and replaced it with, added to it with something more permanent in the Holiday Activity and Food Programme.
Mr. Keith, the very last topic that he asked you about raised a further meeting on the same topic a year later in June 2021. Now, I'm afraid I didn't understand your answer to his question. It may just be me. But can I ask you this? In June 2021, did you personally oppose free meals for poorer school children during the summer holidays in June 2021?
I can't remember at what point we funded instead the Holiday Activity and Food Programme. And because as we were coming out of the pandemic, unsurprisingly, things that were temporary were being removed more generally. Whether it was furlough, whether it was support for self-employed, I mean, it was reasonable not to be able to sustain. You have to remember, we spent almost £400 billion, or more accurately borrowed £400 billion. It was one of the most generous and comprehensive support packages put in place anywhere in the world. It disproportionately did benefit the most vulnerable, and actually poverty actually fell during this period as a result. But it's clear that that's not sustainable forever. So as the pandemic ended and we returned to more normal life, it's reasonable that we returned to a more normal state. But actually, when it came to the situation of free school meals, even though the pandemic support ended, more permanent extra support was put in place. So the provision of meals and indeed activities today is greater and more generously funded than it was before the pandemic as a result of changes that were made.
Mr. Sunak,
that's through the Holiday Activity and Food Programme. And indeed the increase in the what are called Healthy Start vouchers, which are vouchers that are given, I think, to expectant or new mothers for them to use on fresh fruit and milk and things like that when they have new babies. The value of those vouchers was also increased on a permanent basis.
Mr. Sunak, I'm trying not to interrupt you, but I've got limited time. Can I just clarify this matter, please? You told Mr. Keith that you never said anything along the lines of good working people pay for their children to eat and don't want freeloaders. Do you recall a meeting at which anybody in the government expressed such a sentiment?
No.
So as far as you're concerned, it was never said, you don't recall it ever being said by anybody in the UK government?
No.
Can we at least agree on this finally, then, that if anybody had expressed such a sentiment about the parents of poorer school children, that would be a reprehensible thing to say in the circumstances of a pandemic that's caused so much economic turmoil?
Well, it's precisely because I knew that the pandemic was causing particular turmoil for those who are on the lowest incomes that our support deliberately and specifically helped them the most and benefited them the most, because I thought that was the right thing to do, and I think we should be judged especially on our actions, and our actions in this regard were that the support was in place to help the most vulnerable. Now, of course, people would always like you to do more, always like you to do things slightly differently, but in the round, I think it's hard to argue with the proposition that the support we put in place was incredibly comprehensive and, in terms of its scale, generous by international standards, and the evidence is clear that it disproportionately, rightly benefited those on the lowest incomes.
Well, I'm sure that'll be explored in a future module. Thank you, Mr. Sunak.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Mr. Freedman. Mr. Freedman's just behind you to your right, Prime Minister, but if you could make sure you keep your voice into the microphone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. I act for 4 national disabled people's organisations, and we also want to ask you about those proposed regulations in the winter of 2020 to prevent care workers moving between care homes and other placements to stop the spread of the virus. The issue is also dealt with in the statement of Helen Whately, then Minister for Social Care, and of course brought back into that role by you as Prime Minister. And we need not go to it directly, but for the record, it's at INQ 273897. Now, Minister Whately deals with the problem that these proposals sought to fix. The significant number of people worked in more than one care setting. A balance was needed between stopping that happening and protecting people in a profession where, as Whately describes it in paragraph 229 of her statement, staff worked part-time on 0 hours contract, and the majority of that workforce were women and working for often low levels of pay. Now, we've heard your answers to Miss Morris, King's Counsel, who asked you questions for the COVID bereaved families, including that you were not directly involved in these decisions, and there's no criticism on that, Prime Minister. But may we just put the position of the Minister for Social Care to you, just get your reflections on it. First, she'd advocated for a furlough scheme and then a compensation scheme for workers who, under these regulations, were going to be mandated effectively not to work. And that's at paragraphs 236 to 239 of her statement. And in essence, cutting it short, HMT considered these positions, but did not approve either furlough or some further compensation scheme. Instead, as you say in your evidence this afternoon, it proposed a financial scheme to increase the supply of care workers. So, Mr. Sunak, looking back at the situation now, and of course thinking forward as Prime Minister, why reject any kind of furlough scheme or any compensation fund and instead prefer an alternative proposal to increase the supply of labour that didn't actually target the specific problem of staff movement?
Again, I'm afraid I'm not sure I can add much to my previous evidence. I wasn't directly involved in these conversations. I'm not familiar with the various arguments that were being deliberated and policy discussions. So it's very hard for me to speculate or comment beyond what I've already said and my review of the materials, obviously three years later.
Well, just looking forward then, let me just try and help you if it's fair to do so. We know that there was an alternative workplace capacity fund, and it was for £120 million, and it came in from January 2020 to supply additional labour but no payment to not work, and ultimately, the evidence is there, no regulations introduced to stop movement between homes and other settings. So in short, some funding to deal with understaffing, but no additional funding to support not working, and no regulations happened. Instead, there was just voluntary guidance to employers. So from a Treasury point of view, and I'm asking you just to reflect on it now and assist the chair, was this voluntary approach a safe enough approach to the movement of staff between care jobs when it was known that there was a continuing risk that they could not afford to do otherwise?
Again, I'm not obviously familiar with all the policy
I don't recall
debates, so I can't sit here and make a pronouncement on what the right policy would have been. I think that
Run
would be
away,
the opposite
Rishi.
of a good decision-making progress. I can tell
Is that
you
his name, or are you telling him
across
what to do?
all the different health and public services interventions that we
Run away,
made,
Rishi.
a cumulative total of about £150 billion was spent. I think you've heard evidence from the chief executive of the NHS that the government did provide the NHS in particular with the emergency funds needed. I've talked about the billions that were provided to local authorities who are obviously responsible for social care as well. If you're saying that how some of that money was used should have been better prioritised for this versus other things, perhaps, but again, I'm not familiar with the specific policy proposal, why it was deemed to be ineffective at the time, why it was not supported by key system partners, not just the Treasury, but more broadly, because my understanding was there are operational issues with it as well, having reviewed the materials. I can't sit here and speculate on what the right answer is for something that I was not involved in or have no intimate detail about.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. Mr. Thomas, I'm afraid Mr. Thomas is right over by that wall, Prime Minister, so...
Prime Minister Sunak, Leslie Thomas, and I'm instructed by Saunders Law, and I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. You remember them, those are the very people we were clapping for on Thursday evenings at 8 p.m. So some context for you. The Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, told this inquiry that it was entirely foreseeable that there would be disparities in health outcomes during the pandemic because of historically known structural inequalities. I have three short questions for you. One, with your Eat Out to Help Out scheme, specifically, please tell us what were the specific measures or considerations in its design to address the vulnerabilities of ethnic minority workers in the hospitality sectors and other sectors?
Sorry, do you want to do one question at a time? Or?
Yeah.
Well, as I touched on earlier, it was precisely because the millions of people who worked in that industry were disproportionately from vulnerable groups, lower paid, people moving off welfare, people working part-time, women, ethnic minorities, that I thought, as a matter of social justice, those jobs were incredibly important to focus on saving, because all the evidence that we were seeing and talking to businesses was that there was a real fear that they wouldn't be able to protect those jobs and people would have to be let go.
Sorry, forgive me for cutting across you, because time is short, and I know that you wouldn't be trying to talk me down on the clock. My question was very specific.
I like this
My question
guy.
was very specific. What were the specific measures or considerations
last week as well.
in its design to address the vulnerabilities of ethnic minority workers in the hospitality sector? That was my question.
Well,
Just before you answer, Mr. Sunak, Mr. Thomas, I think that comment was inappropriate, so please just answer the question, Prime Minister, and ignore the reference to your deliberately talking Mr. Thomas out.
thank you, milady.
Even though that's blatantly what you're doing.
Better addressed in the government's guidance to the sector, which I referred to earlier, which was considerable, 55 pages long, and supplemented by the 100 pages of guidance issued by UK Hospitality, the Industry Trade Association, which, if you review it, had very detailed guidance that I understand was put together with advice from Public Health England, who are the experts on this, about how to make sure that workforces
Glad we've got
of
some
all
experts here, 'cause you
ethnicities,
certainly weren't.
were protected at work, and the measures such as screens, changing shift patterns, use of different entrance and exits are all some practical things that I can recall. But that's how that consideration was
What do you
properly
recall?
taken care of, not
A
just
lot
in
of
the
it you can't
hospitality
recall.
industry, but across the
Quite
entire
amazing how
economy,
much
and the
stuff
sector
you can't
guidance that was published in conjunction with Public Health England, who are the experts on exactly that topic.
Let's move on. We can agree this, can't we? Albeit in hindsight, your Eat Out to Help Out scheme further exacerbated structural inequalities by placing low-paid workers, such as those who I represent, back into an increased risk of infection. We can agree that, can't we?
No, I don't agree that. These workplaces were safe and deemed to be safe for everybody as a result of the COVID secure guidance that they had to comply with as a matter of reopening. And that was, as I said, determined by the overall reopening plan. And actually, what it did
were you following
was
the science?
protect those people's livelihoods. Because the risk was those people wouldn't have a job to go to if we hadn't done something to try and help and make sure that their businesses were operating. And I think that would have had devastating socioeconomic and health consequences for those low-paid people if the job that they depended on disappeared. And the consequences for them and their family of not having a job would be incredibly significant. And I wanted to do everything I can to prevent that from happening and to save their jobs.
In the planning of the stages of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, what were the assessments made regarding the potential risk of increased transmission within multi-generational households, particularly those from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, as a result of individuals returning to work in the hospitality sector? And did you use equality impact assessments to assess this risk?
They were
I think I've addressed this before, and it would be the same answer. It had already, or Eat Out to Help Out was designed in the context of the safe lifting of MPIs that had been signed off and agreed as part of the May plan. There was considerable COVID secure guidance put in place to safely reopen indoor hospitality, and this scheme operated within all of those constraints, within that guidance that had been previously signed off,
for those
approved,
on COVID,
and
on zero
implemented.
contract hours.
Milady, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Thomas. Mr Metzer. Mr Metzer's over that way, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Thank
Well,
you, my lady.
Mr. didn't show himself in
Mr.
glory
Sunak,
there, did he?
I have a small number of questions on behalf of the long COVID groups. Given the significant multifaceted economic costs resulting directly from long COVID, which the COVID-19 task force had estimated at between 158 and 316 million pounds between the period March 2020 and March 2021 for workplace absenteeism due to the long COVID alone, would you agree that the fact that a significant number of people would suffer from long-term consequences of COVID-19 meant that long COVID was a relevant consideration in your advice as Chancellor to government on policy decisions to limit transmission of COVID-19?
I touched on this briefly in my witness statement. I don't, and I said the Treasury participated in a long COVID forum that had been put together across government. I think actually there was not a huge amount known about it, particularly early on. So I don't recall it being a particular feature of the advice I was receiving or getting from the Chief Medical Officer and others, probably because no one understood it well at that moment in time.
Well, Prime Minister, you do touch upon, I think, one paragraph in your witness statement. But in November 2020, the OBR Economic and Fiscal Outlook reports, we don't need to go there, but it's 000114451 at page 116, referred to the increased need for spending in disability benefits as a result of increases in labour market inactivity as a result of the pandemic, which could be directly related to the virus and specifically referred to long COVID. Do you agree that the OBR reports recognised that there was enough information by the time of the second lockdown to expect that long COVID would result in increased costs to the Treasury and scarring to the economy?
I think without question, we've seen a rise in economic inactivity since the pandemic, and it has been a focus of policy for a while now, with considerable investment, in fact, in various different ways to try and actually support people back into work.
Yes.
But I don't disagree that there has been a rise in economic inactivity.
Yes.
And also that potentially that is something that would have contributed to scarring and identified at the time, yes.
Yes, so you agree from November 2020, the time of the second lockdown, that there was enough information to expect that long COVID would result in increased costs to the Treasury and scarring because of the workplace absenteeism and the rise in long COVID.
I think more generally the concept of scarring, which is multifaceted, and I've given explanation of the different transmission channels for scarring to occur, is something that was already incorporated into the economic forecasting from the OBR, the Bank of England and others, because the prevalent view amongst most economic experts was that there would be scarring impacts as a result of the pandemic. As I said, there are different transmission mechanisms for those. One of them is the labour market, of which this is a subset. So I think there are a variety of reasons for scarring. Estimates of it changed over time. No doubt this was one of them, and it was factored. The scarring impact was factored into all the forecasting that was done.
So, Prime Minister, you do agree specifically in relation to long COVID, a direct health impact, long-term impact arising in the context of workplace absenteeism because of there being known growing numbers of long COVID sufferers?
I haven't seen the precise evidence that links the rise in economic inactivity that we have seen precisely to long COVID. I think actually the surveys that have been done and the evidence and advice that I saw demonstrated that it was far more multifaceted than that, and there wasn't one simple explanation, which is why the problem is actually not so straightforward to reverse, although we are making progress. So I don't recall there being a direct relationship or someone quantifying the specific contribution of long COVID to the rise in economic inactivity. Seems plausible to assume it is playing a part, but everything I've seen suggests that there are a number of factors that have led to the rise in economic inactivity and the scarring impact that we've seen.
But would you agree that the impact of long COVID would be particularly relevant to policy decisions taken at times when there's high prevalence of COVID-19?
With regard to economic inactivity or the impact on scarring, it is one of a number of factors that has led to a rise in economic inactivity, is probably what the evidence suggests. But so as I said, there's a range of reasons for the rise in economic inactivity, not all attributable to long COVID.
No.
But policymakers have to consider them, all of them, not one on its own.
No, but including long COVID, you accept?
It seems plausible to assume that it is a contributing factor, that I can't sit here and tell you that I've seen something that explains exactly what it is contributing to or how much of the rise in inactivity that we've seen is down to that. I haven't seen any precise studies on that, so I just simply can't tell you how much of a feature it is.
But we do know that there's been no advice from, we haven't seen any advice from Her Majesty's Treasury warning of the economic costs of long COVID born from high prevalence of COVID-19. How, if at all, did the economic costs from long COVID inform your advice to the Prime Minister? And are you able to give an example?
No, I mean, as I said, I think more generally, the impact of COVID on the labour market was misestimated by most people because the predominant fear throughout this entire period was significant unemployment, which thankfully didn't manifest itself in the end, but the predominant labour market fear from all economists was about the rise in unemployment that would happen as the furlough scheme was wound down over time. What was underappreciated was the rise or subsequent rise in economic inactivity. It was underappreciated by all, including the Treasury, but all economic commentators, I think, of which, as I said, there are a number of reasons for that.
Yes. Sorry, Prime Minister, can I just cut across you, please? I'm very sorry. In summer 2021, the government started planning for high prevalence of COVID-19, which meant the government was accepting there will be more cases of COVID-19 and therefore, as a result, long COVID. Were the increased costs from more cases of long COVID an accepted trade-off for keeping the economy open?
I don't think the conversation was ever that precise about that particular thing. I think in my recollection of 2021 was a exit roadmap that was put together in February, extensive engagement and discussion with our public health advisors and chief scientific advisor, CMO. I think both of them have said that they feel like that exit roadmap is something that the government got, we all did very well. It had 5-week periods, time to make a step, review data, adjust as needed. Again, like the May roadmap, it was delayed at one stage. All of that was informed with medical and health advice, all of it, and we followed the plan as it was laid out, delayed in one place to accommodate some concerns.
Yes.
But it was put together with the input of the medical advice.
Mr. Sunak, finally this. Do you accept that the economic cost of workplace absenteeism in circumstances with a rising number of persons who are suffering long-term sickness due to long COVID, it was important that be a feature of Her Majesty's Treasury's advice on NPIs, and therefore, if that was taken into account, then that became those increased costs were an accepted trade-off for keeping the economy open?
I'm not sure there was a precise quantification or understanding of the potential costs from that particular reason for a rise in economic inactivity. And as I've said previously, I think the rise in economic inactivity, that it was not something that was foreseen by most economic commentators. The reasons for it are still being bottomed out, but are almost certainly multifaceted and don't exclusively focus on one area. There's obviously an economic cost from economic inactivity. That's why the government is investing, and has been for a while, in reducing it across a whole range of different initiatives, particularly in the health space, but also through DWP to support those who can work to work. And that work has been ongoing now for a long time. I started it, the current Chancellor has continued it. There's considerable funding in place to support people into work and reverse in economic inactivity. But as I said, it's multifaceted.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, my lady.
Right, lastly, Mr Jacobs. Where have you
Okay,
gone?
last one.
At the back again, my lady.
There you go.
Behind the pillar, Prime Minister.
Mr Sunak, my questions on behalf of the Trades Union Congress are regarding financial support for self-isolation. The issue of those on the lowest income facing 2 weeks of self-isolation on the £95 of statutory sick pay, or indeed nothing if they are ineligible. Firstly, is it accurate to describe that the Treasury was urged from many sides to take greater action on financial support for self-isolation?
Well, the first thing to say is that the Treasury did take action. In my first budget that I delivered as Chancellor in March, we made changes to the operation of the statutory sick pay scheme so that it operated from day one rather than from day 4 as was normal, that it covered asymptomatic self-isolators, and we put in place a £500 million hardship fund distributed to local authorities, particularly designed to pick up those hard cases and make sure that those who needed to could get extra support. So those were the decisions that were taken in March. It later became a feature of discussions, I think, at the tail end of the summer. There were some conversations between Number 10 and others, and then there was quite an extensive set of deliberations leading to the announcement in September of the £500 payment to support people to self-isolate.
Mr Sunak, you've described various decisions that were taken. My question, straightforwardly, was a slightly different one. Is it accurate to describe that the Treasury was urged from many sides to take greater action on financial support for self-isolation?
I think it's a fair thing to say that on every single topic, there is always someone urging the Treasury to do more and spend more. I think that is a universal view. You could pick any single policy, and that would be the case, including this, but that would apply equally to any other thing that I did in the pandemic.
While some action was taken, and we'll come on to that, is it right realistically to say that you personally, Mr Sunak, and the Treasury were extremely resistant to any significant scheme of support?
No, I was sceptical that it would make a significant difference to the levels of people self-isolating,
You were against it, then?
which was the purported
So you were
basis
against
for the scheme. And it's entirely reasonable for those conversations to happen, and they did happen, but ultimately a scheme was introduced. It was introduced in September. It provided a £500 payment, and it was introduced as a result of those deliberations in government, testing propositions, and I think, again, that is sign of a process that is working. Ultimately, this is taxpayers' money. It's right that there are conversations that happen to make sure that it's being spent in a way that is effective, and this was just one of those many conversations that happened.
There are a number of references in Sir Patrick's diaries, Mr Sunak, to your personal position, and by way of example, 27th of July 2020, he writes, Dido pushed financial support for people to get tested in low socio-economic groups. Rishi reacted strongly against that and said, basically, just stop the social interactions. For Rishi, it is all about personal responsibility and get the state out. And then on 7th of September 2020, Chancellor blocking all notion of paying to get people to isolate, despite all the evidence that this will be needed. Are those fair characterisations of your position?
No, and they're not borne out by the evidence either, because in August we introduced a pilot scheme in high incidence areas with payments for people to self-isolate, and in September we announced a national scheme, and those conversations were happening throughout August and September more generally, as far as I remember, and having reviewed the evidence.
Why are the born
the proof is that we did introduce a scheme
obsessed
to do
with
that,
personal responsibility?
but like on most things, my job is to scrutinise. It's right that there are debate over policy, and that was the same on this policy, like many others.
They certainly were fair characterisations, weren't they, Mr Sunak? For the first 6 months following self-isolation as a key measure from March 2020 until the end of September when the scheme was brought in, for that period of time, it was an issue that was unaddressed, wasn't it?
No, that's, again, not a fair characterisation. I took action on self-isolation in the first budget that I delivered on the 11th of March, and this didn't then become a particular topic of debate until the end of the summer, and that's unsurprising because that was when the test track and trace scheme had been set up at a proper scale, at which point this became a more relevant consideration. It just wasn't relevant earlier because A, we were in a national lockdown, and B, we didn't have test track and trace up and running with the testing volumes to make this a kind of mass consideration. And when it came up at the end of the summer, we went through it as we would with any other policy. All the evidence at the time and subsequently has not concluded. People have many opinions on this, but no one was able to produce any clear evidence that higher payments would make a difference to compliance rates. Indeed, there were many other reasons people weren't complying, which had nothing to do with their need to work, and it was all about boredom, loneliness, going shopping, reducing symptoms, misunderstanding of the rules. So it wasn't ever clear to me that this was the primary reason, and indeed all the evidence of what we did demonstrated that it didn't make a significant difference, if any, to compliance rates. But we did introduce it, as I said, £500 in September after a pilot study that was done in August.
Mr Sunak, before I move on to my next question, you say that it wasn't relevant in the earlier period. For those on low incomes who kept the country going, working in food processing plants, in transport, in social care, through lockdown, it was highly relevant, wasn't it?
Yeah. And there was considerable support in place for the most vulnerable, as I've documented in my previous answers. Not only did we put in place a £500 million hardship fund for local authorities specifically to help people who most needed it, we temporarily increased universal credit, which was worth £1,000 a year. We increased again significantly the local housing allowance for 1.5 million of the most vulnerable families, worth £600 a year, and we had a self-employment scheme so that all those who were self-employed were benefiting from considerable support whether or not they were still able to work. So there was considerable support in place for everybody, and as I pointed to, the evidence is clear that it did disproportionately benefit the most vulnerable and those on the lowest incomes. My point was that this became a more a more significant consideration in terms of the scale because of test, track and trace. So this had an ability to impact the national progress of the pandemic because we were now testing at such a scale. And as soon as that became a conversation, test, track and trace was set up, we engaged with all those conversations and implemented a scheme in September which provided £500 of support.
On that scheme introduced in September, providing £500 of support, it ultimately had very, very low take-up, didn't it?
Yes, my understanding is around a fifth of people took it up.
In terms of the reasons for that, it was a local authority administered scheme. Was it foreseen that doing it that way would be cumbersome and frankly inaccessible, with many local authorities each implementing their own individual scheme in a slightly different way?
Now, look, that's always the challenge with doing things by local authority, that it will be slightly different even if there's national guidance. I'm not sure there was an alternative. So it was accepted it wouldn't be perfect, but it was better than doing nothing. The only other alternative that was suggested at the time was DWP, but it was clear from all the advice that I'd received and the department themselves that that wasn't practical, not least because it would have required primary legislation, I think, for DWP to have the ability to make payments like that, and they just simply didn't have a delivery apparatus, unlike local authorities who had local welfare assistance schemes and were well placed to know their most vulnerable people, and also local authorities did have access to all the same underlying benefits data as DWP, so none of these are perfect by all means, but I don't think there was a credible alternative to local authorities doing this.
Talk about that one.
Mr. Sunak, sorry, I'm running very short of time.
I think you've run out of time, I'm afraid, Mr. Jacob.
In that case, I better leave it there. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much.
My lady, that concludes the oral evidence.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I appreciate that. Well, I doubt that there's ever an easy time for you to come along here to give evidence, but I appreciate it's difficult this particular week, and thank you for your help.
Thank you for having me.
That completes, as Mr. Keith says, the oral evidence for Module 2. The oral evidence is, I have to repeat and emphasise, just one part of the process. It's an important part, of course it is, but so is the written material. That is also important. So also are the submissions of core participants. And I will consider all that evidence before I reach any conclusions. And I'll hear the submissions of core participants on Wednesday and Thursday, and also, because of the tight timetable, give them an extended time to submit any written submissions to supplement their oral submissions. So I shall return to Module 2 on Wednesday. Thank you all.
All rise. Okay, then. Hello, hi. Sorry, I muted the wrong thing. I muted the desktop audio. Sorry, I muted my my mic instead of the desktop audio. Rewind, you're muted. Okay. All right. I was just saying about the fact that with the leaders that we want, well, the people that we wanted to listen to, giving evidence there to the COVID inquiry were the former Prime Minister and Rishi Sunak, who hopefully is going to be our... he's saying stuff so explosive it can't be broadcast. Yeah, hopefully Rishi Sunak will be our former Prime Minister this time next week. You never know. It will be absolute madness if we have our 6th Conservative Prime Minister in the space of 7 years. That's just mad. Just what? But, you know, Brexit has broken everything, so there you go. Right, from the top, back in the room. So, hopefully that'll be the last of the talk-alongs there to what's happening in the COVID inquiry for a little while. COVID inquiry is going to go on for years, so we might dip into this in future editions of the Labour Socials channel. But tomorrow, I was just saying that we are having the vote on the Rwanda boats, the Stop the Boats Rwanda policy, the third bill that has gone through Parliament to try and stop people coming over from France on boats because they're claiming asylum, because that's the only way you can claim asylum. Third time lucky, they hope, and they've spent 290 million pounds on this Rwanda scheme, which isn't going to work. I can't stress this enough that it's not going to work. So look out for this tomorrow. I might do a little talk along, depending on how things go in Parliament. I might be there for the vote to see what the vote is. That's probably going to come in, I don't know, probably 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. We'll have to see. The debate might go on longer. I'll have to look at the schedule. But it's going to be madness, because if they do, the Tories rally round Rishi Sunak for some reason and get the bill through, it's just going to get held up in the Lords. The Lords can hold up a bill for a year, and they've got to have an election within a year, because that's the rule. It's got to be elections within 5 years of the last one, and obviously by now they would be well into the period before an election where where no policies can get through. So the House of Lords can hold it up and can kill it now. They can kill any bill that comes before them. They might try and use emergency legislation to force it through. I don't think that's going to work, but we will see. Yes, cheaper than a cat. Thank you very much. Am I? I don't know. Anyway, so tonight I'm going to be back at 8 o'clock with a Thompson to do the swear jar, and we're going to be swearing about everything that's going on trying not to swear, but failing miserably about everything that's going on today in Parliament with the discussions they've been having in the Star Chamber, and we'll also be discussing everything else that's been going on in the news the last couple of weeks. We haven't done a swear jar for a couple of weeks, and we haven't had a Labour Social for a couple of weeks either. Sorry, both of those were kind of like out of my hands. The first time on Friday before last, I was in Ukraine. That's a good excuse. I think that's a good excuse. Why didn't you do the swear jar game? I was in Ukraine. Okay, fair enough. And the second, last week I couldn't do it because I was in Liverpool, which is less of a good excuse, but I just, the timings just didn't work out. So we will hopefully be doing the swear jar this week. We'll do a special festive edition, but tonight at 8 o'clock, join us. We're doing the Labour Social at the end of the week. Tonight, Labour on the Labour Social channel, we'll be having the swear jar with A. Thompson at 8 o'clock. Obviously, Tan had some really bad news at the weekend. I don't know if you follow her on Instagram and saw what happened, but she's not really in the best of moods for doing this kind of thing. So we're just going to, me and Aid are going to pick up the mantle, and hopefully we'll have a Super Tan ski along next week. Only 2 weeks till Christmas, peeps. Thanks very much for the chat. Thanks for the super chats. Got some super chats in there. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, people. 8 p.m. Swear jar is at 8 p.m. tonight. By that swear jar will be overflowing. I effing hope so. You've been busy, Graham. I've been, burning the candle at both ends. Might have a day off on Christmas Day. Oh no, I've got to make a roast dinner. Oh shit. Okay. Thanks, Graham and all. Blood pressure better when watching it with like-minded people. Yes, Diane. That's how I feel about it. It's better to watch it with. It's just more entertaining and less infuriating. I feel. So we'll do this again sometime. Hopefully not that soon, but we might do a live show tomorrow and that live commentary for that vote going through, and obviously we'll be doing that for PMQs on Wednesday, which I think is the last PMQs of the year. I think. Might be the last PMQs with Rishi Sunak ever, the way things are going. Watch this space. But until then, thanks very much for watching. Thanks for the chat. Thanks for the super chats. And until next time, hello, good evening, welcome, and goodbye.